In the summer of 1492, as the great Lorenzo de' Medici lay dying in his villa, a secret was buried deep beneath the cobblestones of Florence that would have set the city ablaze had it been known. While history books speak of the Renaissance as a golden age of light and art, the truth is far more stained. In a narrow cellar near the Basilica of San Lorenzo, a low-ranking stonemason named Luca broke through a false wall and discovered something that should not exist. He did not find gold, nor did he find ancient scrolls. Instead, he found a chamber lined with jars of a deep, iridescent crimson fluid and a series of sketches that looked like human anatomy, but were twisted into impossible, divine geometries. This was the forbidden heart of the Medici power. It was a betrayal of every Christian law and a secret covenant with a science that the world was not meant to see. The church knew of it, the artists were complicit in it, and the very foundation of the Renaissance was built upon this moral decay. Every masterpiece you admire in the Uffizi Gallery today carries a trace of this hidden darkness. This is the truth the king buried, the secret that turned the Medici into gods, and the reason why the most beautiful era in human history was bought with a price paid in shadows. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light in your room is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present. Let your mind drift to the narrow, moonlit alleys of 5th-10th century Italy. Feel the weight of the history around you as we descend into the quiet, forgotten places of the past. Florence in the late 1400s was a city of contradictions. On the surface, it was a jewel of the Mediterranean, a place where the air smelled of roasting chestnuts, expensive dyes, and the fresh limestone of rising cathedrals. But beneath that beauty was a complex web of banking, bloodlines, and a desperate search for the keys to the universe. To understand the Sanguine Discovery, one must first understand the house that ruled it all. The Medici were not just bankers. They were seekers of the primordial truth. Cosimo de' Medici, the grandfather of the dynasty, had spent a fortune sending agents to the furthest corners of the East. He wasn't looking for spices or silk. He was looking for the lost manuscripts of Hermes Trismegistus and the forbidden secrets of the Neoplatonists. He believed that the ancients possessed a technology of the soul, a way to manipulate the very fabric of reality through art and observation. This obsession was inherited by his descendants. But by the time Lorenzo the Magnificent took the throne, the search had moved from the library to the laboratory. Imagine the Medici Palace at night. While the public celebrated in the squares, the private chambers of the family were lit by a different kind of fire. This was not the fire of a hearth, but the steady, blue-tinted flame of an alchemical furnace. Historical records often gloss over the fact that the Medici were the primary funders of early experimental science, but they rarely mention the nature of those experiments. They were obsessed with the concept of the vital spark, the unseen force that makes the human body more than just clay. The intellectuals of Florence, from Marsilio Ficino to the young Michelangelo, were regular guests at these secret gatherings. They discussed the magnum opus, the great work of alchemy. In public, they spoke of turning lead into gold. In private, they spoke of something far more valuable, the preservation of human essence. They believed that if they could capture the moment of genius, they could infuse it into their paintings and sculptures, making them truly eternal. This is why, when you look into the eyes of a Renaissance portrait, you feel as though the person is actually there, watching you across 500 years. It was not just skill, it was a systematic attempt to bridge the gap between the living and the canvas. Let us return to Luca, the stonemason. It was an unseasonably cold Tuesday when his chisel struck the hollow stone. He had been hired to repair the foundation of a seemingly ordinary merchant's house, one that shared a rear wall with the Medici's private stables. The merchant was a man named Alessandro, a known associate of the Medici's chief architect. As the stone crumbled, Luca felt a draft of air that smelled of copper and ozone. It was a scent that didn't belong in a cellar. He stepped through the opening, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows against walls made of smooth, dark obsidian. This was not Roman construction, nor was it medieval. It was something else. The chamber was perfectly circular, and in the center sat a table of white marble, stained with a series of concentric circles that looked like they had been etched with acid. On the shelves surrounding the room were the jars Luca had first seen. They weren't just jars. They were sophisticated glass vessels, some interconnected by thin tubes of silver dot as Luca moved closer. His light revealed the contents of the jars. They contained a liquid that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. It was a deep, saturated red, but it had a metallic sheen that caught the light even in the dimness of the lantern. This was the prima materia of the Medici alchemists. It was the byproduct of a process that involved the distillation of rare minerals, ancient botanical extracts, and something the records refer to only as the sanguine contribution. Historical archives recently uncovered in the secret vaults of the Vatican suggest that the Medici had discovered a way to extract the iron and minerals from human blood without causing death. Believing these elements held the memory of the soul, they would then use these minerals to create pigments for their artists. The lapis lazuli and cinnabar used in the most famous frescoes were not just stones ground into powder. They were biological composites. This explains the unnatural vibrancy of the colors in the Sistine Chapel and the Medici chapels. The art was alive, quite literally, with the essence of those who had contributed to the family's glory. Luca's heart hammered against his ribs as he noticed the sketches pinned to the far wall. These were not the works of a student. They were precision drawings of the human nervous system, mapped out with a level of detail that would not be seen in medical books for another 3 centuries. Beside them were notes written in a cipher that combined Latin, Greek, and an unknown series of symbols. These were the blueprints for the Renaissance. The Medici weren't just patrons of the arts. They were the engineers of a new humanity. Why would a family as powerful as the Medici risk everything for this? The answer lies in the deep existential fear that plagued the elites of the 15th century. Death was everywhere. The plague, the constant wars between the city-states, and the terrifying reach of the Inquisition made life feel fragile and fleeting. The Medici, with all their wealth, could not buy another day of life once the clock stopped. Their alchemy was a rebellion against God himself. They wanted to create a legacy that was not just remembered, but physically present. If they could distill the essence of life and put it into a statue, that statue would become a vessel. If they could record the thoughts of a genius into the very paint of a mural, that genius would never truly die. They were building a city of ghosts, a Florence where the past didn't just haunt the present, but directed it. As Luca stood in that crypt, he realized he was looking at the source of the Medici luck, the family's uncanny ability to survive every assassination attempt. Every banking crisis and every political rival wasn't just due to their cunning. They believed they were guided by the echoes of their ancestors, preserved in the very walls of their palaces. The psychological toll on the family was immense. Private letters from Lorenzo's later years show a man who was terrified of his own creations. He spoke of the voices in the stone and the eyes that follow me when I am alone. He was a man who had conquered the world, only to find that he was a prisoner of the secrets he had unearthed. Luca knew that he could never leave that chamber with this knowledge. The silence of the crypt was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that felt as though the very air was watching him. He saw a small leather-bound book on the edge of the marble table. It was the Ledger of Shadows. It contained the names of everyone who had entered that crypt, and more importantly, the names of those who had never left. The stonemason reached out his hand, his fingers trembling as they touched the cold, weathered leather of the book. He knew that opening it would change his life forever. He knew that the moment he turned the first page, he would no longer be a simple worker of Florence. He would be a witness to the lie that sustained the entire world. But curiosity is a powerful thing, a hypnotic pull that draws us toward the flame even when we know it will consume us. The Renaissance is often taught as a triumph of humanism, a time when man became the measure of all things. But in the Sanguine Crypt, Luca saw the darker side of that philosophy. If man is the measure of all things, then man is also the raw material for all things. The Medici had taken the idea of humanism to its most literal and terrifying conclusion. They had created a system where the poor of Florence were not just workers, but resources. In the archives of the San Lorenzo Hospital, there are records of hundreds of unclaimed patients who were transferred to the Medici stables for experimental treatment. They were never seen again. These were the nameless contributors to the beauty we see today. The shadows of the Renaissance are long, and they are cast by the bodies of the forgotten. The realization began to dawn on Luca that the black alchemy wasn't just about art, it was about control. By possessing the biological essence of the people, the Medici possessed their very history. They could rewrite the past and dictate the future. The beautiful facades of the palazzos were like skin, stretched tight over a skeleton of secrets and bone. Luca looked at the jars once more. The liquid was glowing now, a soft, pulsating light that seemed to respond to his breath. It was hypnotic. It was beautiful. And it was pure evil. He thought of his own family, his wife and children sleeping in their small home just a few streets away. Would they too one day become pigment for a Medici masterpiece? Would their lives be distilled into a single, perfect shade of blue on a chapel ceiling? He felt a sudden, sharp chill. The air in the crypt was getting thinner. He heard the faint sound of footsteps above him, the rhythmic clicking of boots on the stone floor of the merchant's house. Someone was coming? Someone who knew exactly where this hidden wall was. Someone who didn't want the secret of the Sanguine Discovery to ever leave this room. Luca scrambled to blow out his lantern, plunging the chamber into a darkness so thick he could feel it against his skin. He retreated into the furthest corner, pressing his back against the cold obsidian wall, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. The footsteps above stopped directly over the center of the crypt. A heavy stone slab began to grind open, a sliver of light cutting through the blackness like a blade dot as the light widened. Luca saw a figure descending a hidden staircase. The man was dressed in the robes of a high official, but in his hand he carried a ledger that Luca recognized immediately. It was the twin to the one on the table, the Ledger of Shadows. But this one was open, and as the man reached the bottom of the stairs, he whispered a single name that made Luca's blood turn to ice. It was not Luca's name. It was a name that belonged to the greatest artist the world had ever known. A man who was currently painting the private chambers of the Pope himself. What was written in that ledger that could destroy the most famous man in Italy? And what did it have to do with the black alchemy that was now glowing with a terrifying intensity on the marble table? The answer was not in the jars, but in the records of the transactions themselves. The true price of the Renaissance was finally about to be revealed. And it was a number that no amount of Medici gold could ever pay. The man in the robes turned toward the corner where Luca was hiding, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. He didn't look surprised. He looked as though he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "The discovery is only the beginning, Luca," the man whispered, his voice like dry leaves on stone. "Now it is time for you to see what lies inside the Ledger of Shadows." The Medici Bank was the most powerful financial institution in the world, but its true wealth was never measured in gold florins. While the public ledgers showed the movement of currency across Europe, there existed a second, darker book known as the Ledger of Shadows. This was not a record of money, but a catalogue of human debt that transcended the physical realm. It was a secret account of every drop of blood, every stolen breath, and every forbidden ritual used to fuel the rise of the Italian Renaissance. The world believes that the great cathedrals and timeless paintings were funded by banking interest, but that is a lie. They were funded by a systematic betrayal of the human soul. Inside this hidden volume were transactions that the Church would have branded as pure heresy. Names of the most famous artists, thinkers, and politicians were scrawled in an ink that smelled of iron and old graves. They didn't borrow money. They'd borrowed time, talent, and life force. Every masterpiece created in Florence carried a hidden tax, a spiritual interest that the Medici collected in the dead of night. If the truth of these transactions had ever come to light, the entire foundation of Western civilization would have crumbled. This is the truth the king buried, the curse that stayed hidden in the vaults for centuries, and the dark contract that turned art into a weapon of the elite. Voiceover start now. Let us turn back the pages of the years. The light in your room is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to the silent, marble-floored hallways of the Palazzo Medici. The flickering candlelight casts long, thin shadows against the tapestries. Feel the stillness of the midnight hour in Florence, where the only sound is the distant tolling of a cathedral bell and the scratch of a quill on heavy paper. We are entering the secret heart of the bank, a place where the air itself feels heavy with the weight of unrecorded history. To the merchants of London, Paris, and Rome, the Medici Bank was a symbol of absolute reliability. It was the first modern bank, a machine of efficiency that moved wealth with the flick of a pen. But the bank was a mask. The architecture of the Medici buildings was designed with a specific psychological purpose. The massive, rusticated stones of the ground floor were meant to convey strength and unshakable security. They wanted the world to see a fortress of gold. But as you moved higher into the private quarters, the stone became smoother, the art more delicate, and the secrets more profound. Behind the public counting rooms, where clerks worked under the watchful eyes of the family, there was a hidden corridor. It was accessible only to the family elders and a few chosen correctors. These were men who didn't understand mathematics, but understood the ancient languages of power. They were responsible for the private archives, the books that never saw the light of a tax auditor's lamp. In these rooms, the air was kept deliberately dry and cool to preserve the vellum of the Ledger of Shadows. This book was bound in the skin of an animal that no naturalist could identify, and its pages were so thin they felt like a whisper between your fingers. Historians have often wondered how a single family could maintain such a stranglehold on European politics for generations. The public records suggest clever marriages and strategic loans, but the Ledger of Shadows tells a different story. It reveals a system of spiritual collateral. If a rival family wanted a loan to build a villa, the Medici didn't just ask for property as security. They asked for something intangible. They asked for the right to observe the family's firstborn or for access to a private chapel for one night a year. These were not financial terms. They were the opening moves in a game of alchemical chess. As we move deeper into the narrative of the ledger, we must look at the specific entries. On page 42 of the reconstructed archive, there is a record dated March 1475 that describes a transaction with a young artist, whose name is now synonymous with beauty. The entry does not mention a commission for a painting. Instead, it records a transfer of vitality. The artist was granted 3 years of perfect clarity and unfailing hand in exchange for a portion of his sleep. It sounds like a fairy tale, but the medical records of the time show that this artist suffered from a mysterious, lifelong insomnia that no doctor could cure. The Medici were collecting the remnant. They believed that during sleep, the human soul releases a specific energy that can be harvested and distilled. The Ledger of Shadows was the accounting book for this harvest. Every artist who was sponsored by the family was actually a donor. They gave their dreams to the Medici, and in return, they were given the technical skill to create works that seemed divine. This is why Renaissance art has a quality that modern art can never replicate. It was infused with the actual dream matter of the creators. Imagine the ledger lying open on a mahogany desk. The names are listed in a column on the left. Beside each name is a symbol. Some are geometric, like triangles and circles. Others are more organic, resembling the veins of a leaf or the constellations of the stars. These symbols represented the type of energy being harvested. Some artists provided the blue light of logic and perspective. Others provided the red heat of passion and raw emotion. The Medici Bank was not just managing money. It was managing the creative output of the human race. They were the silent directors of the greatest cultural explosion in history, ensuring that every masterpiece served their hidden agenda. The room where the ledger was kept was known as the Black Room. It had no windows and was lit only by a single lamp filled with whale oil and lavender. The walls were lined with lead to prevent spiritual leakage. The men who worked in this room, the correctors, were sworn to a vow of absolute silence. Their tongues were often surgically altered to ensure they could never speak the names written in the book. They lived in the basement of the palace, never seeing the sun, their only contact with the world being the documents that were passed to them through a small slot in the door, one of these correctors. A man named Girolamo left behind a series of fragmented notes that were discovered in the 19th century. He described the ledger as having a weight that increased every year. He claimed that the book would sometimes vibrate on the desk as if the names inside were trying to scream. He wrote about the sanguine ink, the same substance discovered by the stonemason Luca in the previous chapter. This ink was not made from minerals, but from the distilled essence of the donors. It allowed the Medici to track their debtors across distance and time. If you were recorded in the Ledger of Shadows, there was nowhere on earth you could hide. The bank used this information to manipulate the geopolitical landscape. If a king in France was becoming too powerful, the Medici would look into the ledger to see which of his advisors were indebted to them. They didn't use blackmail in the traditional sense. They used a form of psychological resonance. They would trigger a memory or a dream in the debtor, causing them to change their mind or fall ill at a critical moment. The Ledger of Shadows was the remote control for the kings of Europe. It was the ultimate leverage, a database of human weakness that allowed a family of bankers to rule as shadow emperors. Let us consider the cost of a single masterpiece, like the birth of Venus or the ceiling of a private chapel. To the viewer, it is a triumph of color and form, but to the Ledger of Shadows, it is a receipt of loss. The ledger records the exact number of hours taken from the people of Florence to power the inspiration of the artist. It was a form of energy vampirism disguised as philanthropy. The Medici would hold grand festivals and public banquets, feeding the people and giving them wine. But these events were actually gatherings. Under the guise of a celebration, the family's alchemist would deploy subtle frequencies and scents to lower the collective defenses of the crowd. They would then harvest the joy and the awe of the masses, funneling it back into the laboratory beneath the bank. This energy was then processed and given to the artists. The beauty of the Renaissance was literally built on the stolen happiness of the common people. It was a massive redistribution of human experience. Moving it from the many to the few, the Ledger of Shadows also recorded the failures. Not every transaction was successful. There are pages in the book that are completely black, charred by some unknown heat. These were the names of those who resisted the harvest, whose souls were too strong or too chaotic to be distilled. These people often met with accidental deaths or were branded as heretics and burned at the stake. The Medici could not allow a non-contributor to exist within their sphere of influence. You were either a source of energy for the bank or you were an obstacle to be removed. The Medici Bank had branches in every major city, from Bruges to Naples. Each branch had its own smaller version of the ledger, but they were all connected back to the main book in Florence through a system of sympathetic resonance. This was the architecture of the vine. Just as a vine spreads its tendrils and leaves, the Medici network spread across the continent, drawing nutrients back to the central root. The bank was a living organism, a predatory entity that grew stronger with every transaction. The Ledger of Shadows contained maps that didn't show roads or rivers, but ley lines of human influence. These maps were used to decide where the next great cathedral would be built. They weren't placed for the convenience of the faithful, but to act as capacitors. The cathedrals were designed to collect the prayers and the emotional energy of the thousands who entered them. This energy was then beamed back to Florence through the resonance of the bells. The Medici had turned the entire religious infrastructure of the West into a power grid for their own alchemical experiments. The bankers were not just counting coins. They were counting frequencies. They understood that a person in a state of prayer is in a highly suggestible and high-energy state. By controlling the spaces where people prayed, they controlled the energy they produced. The Ledger of Shadows was the management tool for this energy. It told the family which cities were productive and which were dying. It allowed them to move their capital, both financial and spiritual, with surgical precision. They were the first globalists, but their empire was not one of land, but of human vibration. We must return to the official who descended into the crypt at the end of our previous story. His name was Bernardo, and he was the keeper of the ledger. He was one of the few who knew the full extent of the transactions. As he looked at Luca the stonemason, he wasn't seeing a man. He was seeing a closing account. Luca had seen the jars, he had seen the crypt, and therefore he had become part of the record. He was now a liability in the ledger of shadows. Bernardo opened the book to a fresh page. The parchment was so white it seemed to glow in the dark room. He picked up a silver stylus and began to draw a circle around a single dot. This was the symbol for containment. He wasn't going to kill Luca, not yet. He was going to process him. He was going to turn Luca's terror into a specific type of dark energy that was needed for a new project in the Medici gardens. The bank never wasted anything. Every emotion, especially fear, was a valuable commodity. The official whispered to Luca that the bank had been watching him since he was a child. They had chosen him for this repair job specifically so he would find the crypt. It was an initiation, a test to see if his soul was of the right quality for the next level of the work. The Ledger of Shadows didn't just record the past, it scripted the future. Luca's entire life, from his choice of wife to the death of his father, had been a series of transactions orchestrated by the bank to bring him to this moment. He was not a stonemason by choice. He was a stonemason by contract, signed before he was even born. The true horror of being in the ledger was the loss of agency. When a person realizes that their every thought is a prepaid response to a banking transaction, the mind begins to fracture. This is what the Medici called the refinement. A fractured mind is easier to harvest. This is why the Renaissance was also a time of extreme madness, of religious manias and sudden, inexplicable violence. The pressure of the secret debt was too much for many to bear. In the ledger, there are notes in the margins written by Lorenzo de' Medici himself. He wrote about the bitter harvest of 1478 after the Pazzi conspiracy. He noted that the fear in the city was so thick it was clogging the filters. He was concerned that the quality of the art produced during that time was becoming too dark, too jagged. He wanted the bankers to smooth out the emotional tone of the city by releasing more gold into the economy. He understood that a happy population produces a higher quality of vitality than a terrified one. The Medici were the ultimate farmers, and Florence was their field. The Ledger of Shadows also shows that the family was starting to lose control. There were leakages. Information was escaping the black room. Some of the artists were starting to include the symbols of the ledger in their public works, hiding them in the folds of a dress or the shadows of a background. They were trying to warn the world. They were trying to show the people that they were being harvested, but the public saw only beauty. They saw only the glory of the Medici. The hidden language of the ledger was invisible to those who weren't already looking for it. Bernardo closed the Ledger of Shadows with a heavy thud that echoed through, the crypt like a tombstone being set in place. He looked at Luca and said that the time for observation was over. The bank was ready to collect its first major installment. He pointed to a name in the book that was circled in a pulsating, deep violet ink. It was the name of a man who was currently at the peak of his fame, a man whose genius was so great it was said he could talk to the angels. "Tomorrow," Bernardo whispered, "this man will begin his final work. And you, Luca, will be the one to provide the sanguine contribution that makes it possible. You should be honored. Your essence will live forever in the most famous ceiling in the world." Luca looked at the name in the violet ink and felt a scream die in his throat. It was a name that everyone in Florence whispered with reverence. It was the name of a man who had been the Medici's greatest investment. But why did the bank need Luca's blood to finish a painting of God? And what was the great work that required a sacrifice so specific and so dark? The answer lay not in the bank, but in the veins of the genius himself. The real debt was about to be called in, and the price would be the very soul of the Renaissance. We are taught that the Renaissance was a miracle of human talent, a sudden explosion of divine inspiration that gifted the world with the most beautiful art ever created. But there is a darker, more terrifying truth hidden in the shadows of the marble and the brushstrokes. The masters of Florence, names like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Botticelli, were not just painting for their patrons. They were trapped in a forbidden contract of blood and spirit. They didn't fear their patrons because of their wealth or political power. They feared them because of the sanguine contribution in the secret archives of the Medici. Genius was not seen as a gift from God, but as a biological resource to be harvested. Every masterpiece we admire today was paid for with the actual physical and mental decay of the artist. The patrons weren't just buying paintings. They were buying the very life force of the creators. Behind the brilliant smiles of the elite was a cold, calculated betrayal of the human spirit. The divine light in these paintings is not a metaphor. It is the literal distillation of human souls, extracted in the dead of night and infused into the pigments. This is the truth the king buried, the secret that kept the masters in a state of constant, trembling terror, and the curse that turned every stroke of genius into a death sentence. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light in your room is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to a candlelit studio in the heart of 15th century Florence. The air is thick with the smell of turpentine, linseed oil, and a faint metallic hint of iron outside. The city sleeps under a heavy, velvet sky, but inside the master is awake, his hand shaking as he holds the brush. Feel the heavy silence of the workshop, where every shadow seems to have eyes and every floorboard creaks with the weight of unsaid secrets. In the Tier 1 educational systems of the West, we are told that genius is an innate quality, a spark of brilliance that some are born with and others are not. But the Medici understood something much more profound. They saw that the state of genius is actually a specific vibration of the human nervous system. It is a moment of heightened clarity where the brain functions at a frequency that allows it to perceive the underlying geometries of the universe to the bankers of Florence. This frequency was a commodity. It was more valuable than gold, more powerful than armies. They realized that if they could stimulate this frequency and then harvest it, they could possess the very essence of creation. They didn't want artists who were merely talented. They wanted artists who were tuned to this specific high-energy state. The apprenticeship system in Florence was not just about teaching technique. It was a massive screening process, a way to find children whose brains could handle the refinement process, described in the Ledger of Shadows, when a young artist showed promise. He was not just given a scholarship. He was entered into the account. From that moment on, his diet, his sleep, and even his thoughts were managed by the Medici's medical alchemists. They were fed rare herbs and minerals designed to keep their minds in a state of perpetual, hyper-focused anxiety. This anxiety was the fuel for the genius. The patrons knew that a content, happy artist produces nothing of true power. They needed the artist to be on the edge of a psychological collapse, because it is only at that breaking point that the vital spark is released. Let us speak of the physical cost, the part of the history that is never mentioned in the tourist brochures. The pigments used in the Renaissance were unlike anything the world has seen before or since. The Medici blue, the Titian red, and the golden glow of the frescoes were not just made from stones and plants. As we discovered in the crypt beneath Florence, they were biological composites. The masters were required to undergo phlebotomy of the soul. Once a month, under the guise of maintaining their health, the artists would visit the Medici's private physicians. These were not regular doctors. They were members of the Black Room, the correctors of the ledger. They would extract specific amounts of blood from the artist, but they weren't just taking blood. They were using a process of magnetic induction to pull the iron and the mineralized. Memories from the artist's veins, this sanguine contribution was then distilled in the underground forge. The minerals were crystallized and ground into the finest powder, which was then mixed with the paints. When the artist applied this paint to the canvas, he was literally painting with his own life force. This is why the colors in these paintings never fade. This is why they seem to glow with an internal light. They are alive. They contain the distilled genius of the man who created them. The artist wasn't just working for the patron. He was becoming the patron's property, bit by bit, stroke by stroke. Consider the most famous ceiling in the world. We are told the artist worked for years on his back, suffering from physical strain and the pressure of a demanding pope, but the private letters tell a different story. The artist wrote about the voices in the plaster and the debt that cannot be paid. He wasn't just exhausted. He was being drained. The Ledger of Shadows records that during the 4 years he spent on that scaffolding, his vitality rating dropped by 70%. He entered the project as a vigorous young man and emerged as a broken, hollow shell. The Pope and the Medici didn't care about his health. They cared about the frequency of awe that his work produced in the thousands of people who would stand beneath it. Every person who looks up at that ceiling today is unknowingly contributing their own energy back into the Medici network. Triggered by the biological pigments in the paint, the artist knew this. He tried to hide warnings in the work. In the shadows of the prophets and the expressions of the angels, he painted his own terror. He painted the faces of the Medici alchemists as demons in the background. He painted the sanguine jars disguised as decorative urns. He was screaming for help through the only medium he had left. But the patrons were clever. They branded his work as divine, ensuring that no one would ever question the source of its power. They turned his cry for help into a celebration of their own glory. One of the most common side effects of the Medici patronage was a total loss of sleep. The history books call it the melancholy of the genius, but the Black Room called it the extraction phase. The alchemists realized that the human brain produces its most potent energy during the transition between wakefulness and sleep. To maximize the harvest, they needed the artists to stay in this liminal state for as long as possible. They used a technique involving silver-toned bells and specific scents like sandalwood, and crushed poppy to keep the masters from falling into deep sleep. The artists lived in a permanent twilight, a hypnotic haze where the line between reality and the canvas began to dissolve. In this state, their technical clarity increased tenfold, but their sense of self began to vanish. They would paint for 48 hours without food, their hands moving with a speed and precision that was physically impossible for a normal human being. The patrons would visit the studios at night, moving like shadows among the easels. They didn't speak. They simply watched. They were there to observe the release. They could see the energy leaving the artist's body and settling into the wet paint. It was a beautiful, terrible sight. The studio would glow with a faint violet luminescence as the artist poured his very soul into the image. To the patron, it was a successful harvest. To the artist, it was a slow-motion suicide. Did any of the masters try to fight back? There are records of several artists who attempted to flee Florence, but the Ledger of Shadows was not just a book of accounts. It was a tracking system. Once the sanguine contribution had been made, the artist was linked to the Medici. They could feel his location through the sympathetic resonance of the pigments. If an artist tried to leave, he would be struck by sudden, paralyzing migraines or visions of his own death. One young prodigy tried to destroy his own work, believing that by burning the paintings he could reclaim his soul. He was found the next morning in his studio, his hands perfectly preserved in a block of marble, but his mind completely gone. The Medici didn't kill him. They turned him into a living warning for the others. The message was clear: your genius is not yours. It is a loan from the bank, and the bank always collects its interest. The fear in the workshops became a constant, humming background noise. The masters stopped talking to one another. They became secretive, paranoid, and obsessed with their work. They knew that their only chance of survival was to produce work so powerful, so high energy, that the Medici would keep them alive just to continue the harvest. It was a race against their own exhaustion. Every masterpiece was a bribe to the shadows, a plea for one more year of life, one more day of breath. We must ask ourselves what happened to these pigments. After the fall of the Medici, the secret recipes were supposedly lost. But the paintings themselves remain. They hang in the world's greatest museums, protected by the most advanced security systems. We are told this is to protect the art from thieves and the elements. But perhaps the security is there to protect the public from the art. The biological pigments in these paintings are still active. They still pulse with the vitality of the masters who created them. If you stand in front of a true Renaissance masterpiece for too long, you will feel a strange sensation in the back of your head. You might feel a sudden surge of unearned emotion or a strange, heavy fatigue. This is the harvest continuing. The paintings are still doing the work they were designed to do 500 years ago. They are collecting the energy of the millions of people who gaze upon them, funneling it back to an unknown destination. The genius of the Renaissance was not a gift to humanity. It was a trap. It was a way to create permanent, high-energy batteries that would power the elite for centuries. The masters knew this. They feared their patrons because they knew they were being turned into objects. They were being consumed by the very beauty they were creating. Every time we praise the immortality of these artists, we are unknowingly celebrating their eternal imprisonment in the paint dot as the era of the High Renaissance came to a close. The Medici alchemists realized that the quality of genius was changing. The artists were becoming too aware of the system. The refinement process was no longer as effective. They needed a new way to harvest the human spirit. They began to look toward the New World, toward the burgeoning sciences of the Enlightenment, the Ledger of Shadows, records of final meeting in the Black Room in 1520. The correctors decided that the age of the individual genius was over. It was time to move to the age of the machine. They began to design systems that would harvest energy not from single artists, but from the entire population through industrial labor and mass media. But the foundation of all these modern systems is the sanguine tech, developed in the workshops of Florence. The masters died in poverty, in madness, and in silence. Their bodies were often buried in unmarked graves, but their sanguine contribution lives on. It is in the architecture of our cities, the pigments of our most famous works, and the very structure of our modern debt-based economy. The masters feared their patrons because they saw the future. They saw a world where the human soul would be nothing more than a line item in a banker's ledger. Let us return to the crypt where Luca the stonemason and Bernardo the official stand over the ledger of shadows. Bernardo has just revealed that a new sacrifice is needed for the great work. He has named the genius who will be the donor, but he hasn't revealed where the extraction will take place. The blood is only the conduit. Luca, Bernardo whispers, his eyes reflecting the violet glow of the alchemical jars. The true power lies in the heat of the forge. We have the soul of the artist, but we lack the perfect vessel to contain it. Tomorrow, we take you to the place where the marble is born and the metal is cursed. We take you to the underground forge. Luca looks at the official and realizes that his role as a stonemason was never about repairing walls. It was about building a furnace. A furnace that would not burn wood, but would burn the very history of Florence. What is waiting in the underground forge? And what is the forbidden object that the Medici are trying to create with the blood of the genius? The truth is deeper than the earth itself, and it is waiting for us in the heat of the shadows, deep beneath the sun-drenched plazas of Florence. Hidden under the heavy foundations of the Palazzo Vecchio lies a chamber that no map has ever dared to record. It is a place of heat, shadow, and a terrifying betrayal of the laws of nature. While history tells us the Medici family commissioned the world's greatest bronze statues to celebrate the city's glory, the truth is far more sinister. They were not forging art. They were forging vessels for the human soul. The furnaces of the underground forge did not burn with coal or wood, but with a forbidden blue flame fueled by the very breath of those the family deemed expendable. Inside this laboratory, the most brilliant alchemists of the 5th-10th century worked in secret to achieve the ultimate transmutation. They were not interested in turning lead into gold. They were interested in turning human consciousness into permanent, unbreakable objects. This was a dark covenant with an ancient science, a secret buried beneath layers of marble and lies. Every bronze masterpiece that stands in the squares of Florence today was birthed in this furnace of suffering, infused with a life force that was never meant to be trapped in metal. The moral decay required to fuel these fires was absolute, a curse that the Medici family carried in their blood for generations. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift down a narrow, spiraling staircase, deep into the belly of the earth where the air is warm and smells of sulfur and old iron. We are entering the secret heart of the forge, a place where time stands still and the only sound is the rhythmic, heavy pulse of the bellows. To understand the underground forge, one must understand the obsession of the Medici with the works of the ancients. In 1460, an agent of the family discovered a manuscript in a remote monastery that was said to contain the lost metallurgy of the Neoplatonists. This was not a book of art. It was a manual for ensouling the inanimate. The family immediately funded a secret excavation beneath their primary residences. creating a network of tunnels that functioned like a biological circuit. The forge itself was a masterpiece of hidden engineering. The walls were lined with a specific type of volcanic clay brought from the base of Mount Etna, believed to hold the primordial heat of the earth. The floor was etched with silver lines that traced the constellations as they appeared on the night of the family's rise to power. This was not a workspace. It was a temple to a forgotten god of the forge. The alchemists who worked here were known as the smiths of the remnant. They were men who had been erased from public record. Their families told they had died of the plague, so they could dedicate their remaining years to the Medici's dark science. The center of the room was dominated by the Great Crucible. It was a massive vessel made of an alloy of copper, tin, and a third unnamed metal that the records call star iron. Unlike a standard furnace, this crucible did not sit over a fire. It was suspended in a vacuum of air, held in place by massive magnets. The heat was generated through a process of vocal resonance. A choir of 12 men would chant specific, low-frequency tones for hours on end, creating a vibration so intense that the metal inside the crucible would begin to glow and melt without a single spark. This was the silent heat, a technology that the modern world is only now beginning to understand. As the metal in the crucible reached its liquid state, it was time for the infusion. This is where the sanguine contribution met the art of the forge. We have spoken of the pigments used in paintings, but the process for bronze was much more demanding. A painting holds only a fragment of essence, but a statue requires a complete vital spark. To become a true vessel, the alchemists would use a series of silver bellows to pump a specific gas into the liquid metal. This gas was not air. It was the breath of the dying. The Medici had established a system where those in their final moments, often from the local hospitals or the unclaimed populations, were brought to a room directly above the forge. As they took their last breath, it was captured in leather bags and funneled down through silver tubes into the crucible. The alchemists believed that the final breath contained the concentrated history of a human life, the unique signature of a soul as it attempts to leave the body. By bubbling this final breath through the molten star iron, they were essentially flavoring the metal with human experience. The bronze would change color, turning from a dull orange to a brilliant, shimmering violet. This was the sign that the metal had become receptive. It was now ready to be poured into the mold. But the mold was not made of sand or wax. It was made of a mixture of ground bone and the same volcanic clay, sculpted with a level of detail that captured every pore and every fine hair of the human form. The men who worked in the underground forge were plagued by a specific type of madness. They reported hearing voices coming from the molten metal, a cacophony of whispers that grew louder as the metal cooled. They called it the chorus of the cast. It was the sound of hundreds of different lives, all trapped in a single unmoving object. To combat this, the smiths of the remnant were required to wear heavy lead masks that covered their ears, effectively cutting them off from the world of sound. The psychological layer of this work was immense. The Medici understood that for the statues to be effective as power capacitors for the city, the metal had to be in a state of constant internal tension. They wanted the souls inside the bronze to be aware of their imprisonment. This awareness created a static charge that the family could use to manipulate the emotions of the public. When a citizen of Florence stood before a Medici bronze, they weren't just looking at art. They were being scanned by the collective consciousness of the souls, trapped within the metal. This is why the great bronze statues of the Renaissance have an energy that is almost overwhelming. They feel as though they are about to move, as though they are holding their breath. It is because in a very real biological sense they are. They are the permanent record of thousands of final moments, frozen in time by the alchemical fire. The masters who designed the outer forms, like Donatello or Verrocchio, were often kept in the dark about the true nature of the metal they were using. They saw only the results, a bronze that flowed like water and captured light like a diamond. One of the most guarded secrets of the underground. Forge was the network of silver tubes that connected the laboratory to the various palaces and churches above. These were not just for the breath of the dying. They were a two-way system. The alchemists could broadcast the frequencies generated in the forge up into the streets of Florence. During times of civil unrest or political crisis, the Medici would activate the resonance of calm. They would melt down a specific sacrificial object in the forge, an object that had been infused with the essence of a peaceful, content individual. The resulting vibration would be piped up through the tubes, hidden within the architecture of the city's fountains and monuments. The people of Florence would suddenly feel a wave of inexplicable peace and loyalty to the family. It was the first form of mass psychological control, a way to tune the population to the families. Frequency. The cost of this control was a steady supply of raw material, the ledger of shadows, records that the demand for final breath increased significantly during the reign of Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was a man who understood that power is not maintained by force, but by the management of the invisible. He turned the entire city into a laboratory, and the underground forge was the engine that kept it running. The alchemists became the most important men in the dynasty, more vital than the generals or the bankers, for they were the keepers of the city's very soul. In 1494, as the Medici were briefly expelled from Florence, a group of the smiths of the remnant attempted to destroy the forge. They realized that the vessels they had created were becoming too powerful, that the collective consciousness in the metal was starting to turn against its creators. They tried to flood the chamber with water from the Arno River, hoping to quench the silent heat forever, but the star iron did not react like normal metal. When the water hit the glowing crucible, it didn't create steam. It created a flash of memory. The alchemists were hit by a tidal wave of every life they had ever distilled. Hundreds of them were found days later, wandering the streets of Florence in a state of total catatonia, their eyes wide and staring. Their skin turned a strange metallic gray. They had been overwritten by the very souls they had tried to trap. The forge was eventually resealed by the returning Medici, but the damage was done. The resonance of calm was broken, replaced by a resonance of dread. This explains the sudden shift in the city's atmosphere during the late 1490s. The rise of religious fanatics like Savonarola, and the public's sudden, violent turn against the family. The metal was screaming, and for the first time in a century, the people were beginning to hear it. The underground forge had become a liability, a source of spiritual pollution that threatened to consume the entire city. Is the underground forge still there? Archaeological surveys of the Palazzo Vecchio have found unexplained voids in the bedrock, and modern sensors often pick up a faint, low-frequency hum that cannot be traced to any machinery. Some believe that the furnaces were never truly quenched, that they are still burning with the residual heat of the star iron, the bronze statues that were birthed. They have been moved to museums all over the world. They carry the Medici frequency with them, acting as silent observers in the galleries of London, New York, and Paris. When you stand before one of these works, you might feel a sudden, sharp chill or a sense that you are being watched. This is not your imagination. You are interacting with a 500-year-old alchemical battery. The vital spark inside the metal is still reaching out, still trying to find a way back to the world of the living. The Medici may be gone, but the infrastructure they built remains. The underground forge was the prototype for every modern system of control. It was the place where humanity was first treated as a resource to be refined and stored. As we look at the history of the Renaissance, we must ask ourselves what other masterpieces are currently being forged in the hidden places of our own world. Are we, too, becoming pigment or metal for a new elite? The shadows of the forge are long, and they are reaching for us even now. For the smiths who survived the flood of memory, the world became a nightmare of overlapping realities. They could no longer distinguish between their own thoughts and the echoes of the cast. They wrote of a world where everything was liquid metal, where the walls of the city were made of frozen screams. They were the first victims of the alchemical burn, a condition where the mind is literally melted by the exposure to too much. Concentrated human experience, the Medici family eventually, turned these broken men into living statues, placing them in the niches of their private gardens. They were kept in a state of permanent hypnotic trance, their gray skin making them indistinguishable from actual marble. They were the final experiment of the underground forge, the transmutation of a living human into a functional object without the use of fire. It was the ultimate refinement, the point where the art and the artist became one and the same dot in the final pages of the Ledger of Shadows. There is a note regarding the closure of the forge. It states that the fire was not extinguished, but transferred. The alchemists realized that they no longer needed a physical furnace. They had found a way to use the collective fear of the population as the fuel. The city itself had become the crucible, and every citizen was a contributor to the heat. The forge had moved from beneath the ground into the very hearts of the people. This was the final victory of the Medici, the creation of a system that powers itself through the suffering of its subjects. Luca the stonemason and Bernardo the official stand at the edge of the great crucible, the violet light reflecting in their wide, terrified eyes. Bernardo holds the Ledger of Shadows open, his finger pointing to a new entry that has just appeared in the sanguine ink. It is not a name, but a date, tomorrow's date. The forge is hungry. Luca, Bernardo whispers, the blue flame dancing in his pupils. But it is no longer satisfied with the breath of the dying. It requires the silent scream of the living. And there is one statue in this city, a masterpiece of white marble, that is hiding a secret even darker than this forge. It is the work of a man who thought he could outsmart the Medici. It is the David. What is hidden inside the world's most famous statue? And why does the underground forge require the silent warning of Michelangelo to complete its final transmutation? The truth is not in the metal, but in the stone. And it is a truth that will change everything you thought you knew about the face of God. The warning is there. If you know where to look, the world looks at the David and sees the pinnacle of human beauty. But Michelangelo looked at the marble and saw a prison of souls. In 1501, when the young artist took up his chisel against the massive block known as the Giant, he wasn't just carving a statue. He was recording a desperate, silent warning to every human being who would ever stand in its shadow. The Medici were not just patrons of the arts. They were collectors of human essence, and Michelangelo had discovered the horrific truth of the sanguine contribution. He realized that the very stone he was carving was being prepared as a massive biological capacitor, designed to harvest the awe and the vitality of the citizens of Florence. For centuries to come, the David is not a hero facing a giant. It is a warning of a hidden massacre. Every vein, every tensed muscle, and the strange, haunting focus in the statue's eyes were coded by Michelangelo to reveal the secret of how the Medici distilled the vital spark from the living. He betrayed his masters in the only language they couldn't censor, the language of stone. If you look closely at the right hand, you will see a secret that should have stayed buried in the underground forge. The David is a map of the soul's extraction, a curse carved in white Carrara marble that was meant to alert us to a betrayal that has lasted 500 years. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light in your room is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to the dusty, whitewashed workspace in the shadow of the Florence Cathedral. The air is thick with the fine, chalky dust of marble, and the rhythmic clinking of a mallet against the chisel is the only heartbeat in the room. Feel the cool, heavy stillness of the stone, a block that has waited in the rain for 25 years for a master who could hear its screams. To understand the warning, we must understand the stone itself. The block of marble that became the David was known as the Giant, a massive piece of Carrara stone that had been rejected by two other masters before Michelangelo. They said it was flawed, that it had too many veins, and that it was too narrow to hold a human form. But the Medici alchemists knew better. They had specifically selected this block because it had been seasoned in a particular way. It had sat in the courtyard of the Opera del Duomo, exposed to the elements and the emotional vibrations of the city for a quarter of a century. Stone is not an inanimate object to an alchemist. It is a slow, vibrating memory. This block had absorbed the prayers, the fears, and the secret whispers of Florence for decades. It was already a vessel saturated with the collective consciousness of the people. When the Medici gave the block to Michelangelo, they weren't just giving him a material. They were giving him a battery. Their instruction was simple: create a figure of such overwhelming beauty that no one would be able to look away. They needed a focal point, a giant lens through which they could focus the city's energy back into the underground forge. Michelangelo, however, was a man of deep, troubled faith and even deeper secrets. He had spent his youth in the Medici gardens, sitting at the feet of the same alchemists who managed the Ledger of Shadows. He knew their ciphers. He had seen the sanguine jars being filled in the dead of night. As he began to clear away the outer layers of the stone, he realized the marble was responding to his touch in a way that was unnatural. It wasn't just stone. It felt like flesh that had been turned to ice. He realized the Medici had prepared the block with a solution of distilled iron and ground bone, making it a perfect conductor for the vital spark. Michelangelo decided to hide the truth in the anatomy itself. For centuries, doctors and historians have marveled at the anatomical precision of the David. They point to the jugular vein in the neck, which is distended exactly as it would be in a man who is tensed and alert. But in 1504, medical science did not officially know about the mechanics of the circulatory system in such detail. How did Michelangelo know? He knew because he had seen the extractions. The distended vein in David's neck is not a sign of courage. It is the map of the primary extraction point used by the Medici alchemists. By carving it with such prominence, Michelangelo was marking the very spot where the soul's heat is most easily drawn from the body. He was showing the world where the patrons were placing their silver needles. If you look at the torso, the muscles are not in a state of rest or even a state of battle. They are in a state of alchemical tension. This is a specific physiological reaction to the refinement process. Michelangelo was depicting a human being in the moment their essence is being harvested. The most shocking code, however, is in the hands. The right hand of the David is disproportionately large. Art historians call it a symbol of strength, but look closer at the back of that hand. The veins form a specific geometric pattern that matches the layout of the underground. Forge. Michelangelo was telling us that the hand that moves the world is actually powered by the secret. Works beneath the city. He was carving a signature of his own enslavement. He made the hand too large so that the eye would be drawn to it, forcing the viewer to confront the source of the power. The hand doesn't hold a weapon. It holds the very mechanism of the city's control. Perhaps the most hypnotic part of the statue is the gaze. David is not looking at Goliath. He is looking toward Rome, toward the seat of the church and the other great power center of the Renaissance. But look at the pupils of the eyes. Michelangelo carved them in the shape of hearts. This has often been interpreted as a symbol of David's love for his people, but in the language of the Black Room, a heart-shaped pupil signifies the captured gaze. The eyes of the David were designed as optical funnels. When a viewer locks eyes with the statue, a psychological circuit is completed. The beauty of the form lowers the viewer's defenses, and the heart-shaped pupils act as a vacuum, drawing a tiny fraction of the viewer's awe into the core of the marble. This energy is then transmitted down through the pedestal, which was originally designed to sit over a specific silver-lined well in the Piazza della Signoria. That well connected directly to the silver tubes of the underground forge. Michelangelo knew that he was creating a predatory object. He knew that his masterpiece would be used to feed the family he both loved and loathed. To warn us, he gave David a look of profound, tensed apprehension. This is not the face of a victor. It is the face of someone who knows they are being watched by something they cannot see. He was trying to reflect the viewer's own danger back at them. He wanted us to feel the same unease he felt every time he looked into the eyes of his patrons. He was telling us that the art is looking back at us and it is hungry. During the 3 years he worked on the statue, Michelangelo's health began to fail in a way that mirrored the descriptions in the Ledger of Shadows. He became a hermit, refusing to let anyone see the work. He slept in his boots, often not eating for days. The Medici sent their physicians to check on him, and each time they left, Michelangelo would carve a small, hidden mark on the underside of the statue's base. These marks were tally of the sanguine contributions he was being forced to make to keep his creative clarity. He noticed that the marble seemed to be growing warmer as he reached the inner core. He wrote in his private journals, which were later suppressed by the church, that he felt he was releasing something that had been trapped in the stone for 1,000 years. He believed the marble was a cemetery of the ancient world's genius, and the Medici were using him to resurrect that power for their own use. He feared that by giving the stone a human form, he was giving the black alchemy a body to inhabit. This is why the statue has no armor and no sword. David is completely exposed. This was Michelangelo's way of showing the vulnerability of the human soul against the refining fires of the elite. He was saying that no amount of physical strength can protect you if your essence has been borrowed by the bank. The nudity of the David is not about the beauty of the human form. It is about the stripped status of the citizen under the Medici. We are all naked before the ledger of shadows, and our only defense is the silent warning that Michelangelo left in our path. When the statue was finally moved from the workshop to the piazza in 1504, it took 4 days and 40 men to move it just a few hundred yards. The official reason was the weight of the stone, but the secret record suggests something else. The statue was humming. The vibration was so intense that the wooden rollers used to transport it began to smoke and char. The workers were terrified, claiming that the giant was trying to speak. The Medici organized a grand unveiling, but it was actually a massive harvesting ritual. They placed the statue in a specific position so that the morning sun would hit the David's forehead, at exactly the same time the cathedral bells rang. This created a resonance that was felt by everyone in the square. People reported feeling a sudden, overwhelming sense of love and fear for the Medici. They wept without knowing why. They felt their hearts swell with a pride that didn't belong to them. Michelangelo stood in the back of the crowd, his face covered by a hood. He saw the silver lines appearing on the surface of the marble as it absorbed the collective energy of the city. He saw his silent warning being ignored as the people fell under the spell of the beauty. He realized that he had been too successful. He had carved a prison so beautiful that the prisoners loved their chains. He had given the Medici exactly what they wanted: a permanent, divine-looking capacitor that would keep the population tuned to the family's frequency forever. The warning was not just in the statue, but in the very space it occupied. Michelangelo insisted on a specific design for the pedestal, one that was much higher than originally planned. This was to ensure that the viewers had to look up at the David in the psychology of the Black Room. The act of looking up at an angle of 45 degrees opens the third portal of the mind, making it easier for the alchemical funnels in the statue's eyes to work. However, on the back of the pedestal, where it was hidden from the public view, Michelangelo carved a series of counter symbols. These were meant to act as a grounded circuit. He was trying to short-circuit the harvesting process. He hoped that if even one person understood the geometry, they could trip the switch and release the trapped energy back into the people. But the Medici alchemists discovered his sabotage. Instead of destroying the statue, they simply moved it. They moved the David several times over the centuries, eventually placing it inside a controlled environment in the Accademia. They told us it was to protect the marble from acid rain. But the reality is that the resonance of the David had become too unstable in the open air. The warning Michelangelo had carved was starting to infect the visitors, making them feel the master's own terror instead of the family's glory. By placing it in a museum, they could filter the energy through modern security systems, ensuring the harvest continued without the risk of a spiritual rebellion. Today, over 1 million people visit the David every year. They stand in long lines, they pay their tribute, and they gaze into those heart-shaped pupils. If you watch the visitors closely, you will see a pattern. They enter the room with energy and excitement, but as they leave, they are often quiet, subdued, and strangely tired. The sanguine tax is still being collected. The David is still doing the work it was carved to do. Modern restorers have noted that the marble of the David is unusually dense in certain areas, particularly around the heart and the brain. They use ultrasound to check for cracks, but the results are always inconclusive. Some technicians have whispered that the scans look more like organic tissue than mineral deposits. They find voids that seem to shift position over time. The statue is not a stagnant object. It is a living record of every person who has ever looked at it. The silent warning of Michelangelo is still there, but it is being drowned out by the noise of the modern world. We are taught to appreciate the art, but we are never taught to listen to the stone. The master's fear is recorded in every chisel mark, a desperate plea for us to look past the beauty and see the trap. He was the greatest artist who ever lived, but he died a broken man, haunted by the knowledge that his greatest work was a weapon used against his own kind. He left us the map to our own liberation, but we are too blinded by the divine light to read it. As we stand before the David, we must ask ourselves, if Michelangelo's greatest masterpiece was a warning, what did he hide in the shadows of his even more ambitious work? What secret was so dangerous that he spent the final years of his life trying to burn his own drawings? The answer is not in the marble, but in the flesh of the gods. Michelangelo had discovered that the vital spark could be moved from the stone into something even more permanent. He had found the golden substance that the Medici had been searching for in their underground forge, and it wasn't hidden in a statue, but in the very heart of the family themselves. The decay of the dynasty was about to begin, and the master was the one who held the key to their collapse. But to find it, we must look at the sanguine ledger one last time to the account of the one who was never meant to be born. The final secret of the Renaissance is about to be unveiled, and it is a truth that will make the David's warning seem like a whisper in a storm. We have been told for centuries that the golden glow in the paintings of the Renaissance was merely a masterclass in light and shadow, but that is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide a horrific alchemical truth. In 1482, within the secret laboratories of the Medici, a substance was discovered that bridged the gap between the physical and the divine. It was not gold found in the earth, but a golden substance distilled from the very center of the human brain. The Medici alchemists realized that at the moment of peak creative ecstasy or profound terror, the human spirit produces a biological luminescence that can be harvested, refined, and bottled. This forbidden substance was the true fuel for the Renaissance. It was mixed into the paints of the world's most famous masterpieces to give them an unnatural, hypnotic power that continues to drain the vitality of every person who gazes upon them today. The elites were not just patrons of art. They were the architects of a massive spiritual extraction. They betrayed humanity by turning the human soul into a luxury commodity, used to decorate their palaces and extend their own lives. Every shimmering halo and every radiant sunset in these paintings is a record of a stolen life force, a biological residue of a person who was distilled into a jar. This is the truth the king buried, the secret that turned bankers into gods, and the reason why the most beautiful era in history was built on a foundation of systematic spiritual theft. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light in your room is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to the silent, moonlit corridors of a secret villa in the hills of Tuscany. The air is cool and smells of rare incense and ancient earth. Hear the distant rhythmic dripping of a water clock and the soft, steady hum of a hidden furnace. We are entering the most sacred and terrifying space in the Medici Empire, the place where life itself is refined into gold. To understand the discovery of the golden substance, we must understand the Medici's obsession with the light of the ancients. They did not believe that light was a wave or a particle. They believed it was a liquid, a primordial fluid that once filled the universe before the fall of man. They were convinced that fragments of this divine light remained trapped within the human body, specifically within the brain, hidden behind the third eye. In the late 1470s, Marsilio Ficino, the family's chief philosopher and alchemist, received a collection of fragments from a sunken vessel off the coast of Greece. These fragments described a process used by the priests of the Orphic mysteries to extract the sun from the minds of their initiates. Ficino realized that this was not a metaphor, it was a biological reality. He began a series of secret experiments, funded by the limitless wealth of the Medici Bank, to find the physical vessel of this light. He discovered that the human brain contains a tiny, pine cone-shaped gland that the ancients called the seat of the soul. Under normal conditions, this gland is dormant, producing only the shadows of dreams. But under the pressure of intense spiritual heat, it begins to produce a substance that is both solid and liquid, a shimmering golden oil that defies the laws of chemistry. Ficino called this the chrysovitalis, or the golden substance. It was the physical manifestation of the vital spark, the literal light of life. The process of obtaining this substance was as precise as it was cruel. It could not be taken from the dead, for the light vanishes the moment the heart stops. It had to be distilled from the living. The Medici alchemists developed a technique they called the refined incubation. A donor, often a young artist or a person of exceptional mental clarity, would be placed in a sensory deprivation chamber for weeks. The chamber was lined with copper and silver plates designed to focus the Earth's magnetic field into the donor's skull. They were fed a diet of specific minerals and salts to sensitize their nervous system. As the donor reached a state of hyper-awareness, they were subjected to harmonic stress, a series of frequencies played on silver bells that caused the golden substance to begin to crystallize within the pineal gland. Once the harvest point was reached, a small silver needle, no thicker than a hair, was used to extract the substance. The donor felt no physical pain, but the psychological cost was absolute. To lose even a drop of the golden substance was to lose one's capacity for joy, wonder, and creativity. Those who were harvested became the hallowed, living shells who wandered the Medici estates with blank expressions, their inner light gone, their history erased. This was the dark price of the Renaissance, the hollowing of the many to create the illumination of the few. Once the golden substance was harvested, it was taken to the underground forge for refinement. It was mixed with a carrier oil made from the rarest botanical extracts of the East. This mixture was then given to the family's most trusted painters. They were told that this divine pigment was a gift from God, a secret medium that would make their work eternal. When this paint was applied to a canvas, it didn't just dry like normal pigment. It bonded with the surface, creating a microscopic layer of biological light. This is why paintings like Botticelli's Birth of Venice or the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel have a glow that seems to come from within the figures themselves. It is the literal essence of the hollowed donors trapped in the paint. The golden substance acts as a beacon. It is designed to resonate with the pineal glands of the viewers. When you stand in front of these paintings, the substance in the paint calls to the substance in your own brain. This is what we call aesthetic awe. It is not a natural emotional reaction. It is a biological extraction process. The painting is drawing a tiny fraction of your own light into itself to maintain its glow. The great museums of the world are not galleries. They are spiritual batteries, kept alive by the collective energy of the millions of people who visit them every year. The Medici did not just use the golden substance for art, they used it for themselves. In the private diaries of the family elders, there are references to a golden cordial, a drink that could halt the hand of time. They believed that by consuming the distilled essence of human genius, they could incorporate that genius into their own bodies. They would mix the substance with wine and drink it during their most secret rituals. The effects were immediate and terrifying. Their skin would take on a subtle golden sheen, and their minds would become capable of calculations and strategies that seemed superhuman. This is how the Medici maintained their power for 300 years. They weren't just smarter than their rivals, they were biologically superior, fueled by the distilled spirits of the people they ruled, but the golden substance carried a curse. It was a foreign material, a stolen light that was never meant to be ingested. Over time, the family members began to suffer from a condition known as the alchemical gout. Their bodies began to crystallize from the inside out. Their bones became as hard and brittle as glass, and their eyes turned a deep, solid gold. They were becoming statues while they were still alive, the very fate they had inflicted on their donors. The elixir of life was slowly turning into a stone of death. The alchemists realized that the golden substance was arranged in a specific, sacred geometry. When viewed under a primitive lens, the crystals formed patterns that matched the architecture of the great cathedrals. This confirmed their belief that the human body was the blueprint for the universe. They began to design their palaces and cities to mimic the structure of the pineal gland. The city of Florence itself was laid out as a giant extraction machine. The position of the Duomo, the Palazzo Vecchio, and the various Medici villas formed a geometric grid, designed to focus the spiritual heat of the population toward the center of the city. The festivals, the parades, and the religious processions were not for public entertainment. They were excitation events designed to make the population produce more golden substance. The people were like honeybees, and the Medici were the beekeepers, carefully managing the environment to ensure the maximum production of the golden honey. The architecture of the Renaissance was not about beauty. It was about efficiency. Every archway and every column was a tuning fork, designed to vibrate at the frequency of the pineal gland. The people of Florence lived in a giant, open-air laboratory, their lives being harvested in a way they could never perceive. In the late 1490s, a strange phenomenon began to occur in the streets of Florence. A group of the hallowed, those who had survived the distillation process, began to gather in silence outside the Medici palaces. They didn't speak, they didn't protest, and they didn't move. They simply stood and stared at the walls with their empty, gray eyes. This silent gathering created a null zone, a disruption in the city's spiritual grid. The Medici alchemists reported that the harvest rate was dropping and that the paintings in the palaces were losing their luster. The hallowed were somehow acting as a vacuum, drawing the golden substance back out of the architecture and the art. It was a rebellion of the empty, a return of the stolen light. The family reacted with extreme violence, branding these people as possessed and having them removed to secret underground facilities. But the damage was done. The secret of the golden substance began to leak out. Savonarola, the fanatic monk, began to preach against the vanities of the Medici, claiming that their art was a demon's bait. He was closer to the truth than anyone realized. The bonfire of the vanities was not just about burning art. It was a desperate attempt to destroy the spiritual batteries before they could consume the city. What happened to the jars of golden substance that remained in the Medici vaults? When the dynasty finally collapsed in the 1700s, the Ledger of Shadows suggests that the remaining supply was smuggled out of Italy and taken to the new centers of power in London and eventually America. The alchemical science of the Renaissance didn't disappear. It evolved. Today, we no longer need secret chambers and silver needles to harvest the human spirit. We have developed digital distillations. The high-frequency blue light of our screens, the algorithms designed to trigger constant emotional peaks and valleys, and the systematic hollowing of our attention spans are the modern versions of the Medici's laboratory. We are being harvested every second of every day, our vital spark being funneled into a global grid of content and data. The golden substance is now invisible, but its effect is the same. We feel more connected than ever, yet we feel a profound sense of hollowness. We gaze at the digital masterpieces of our era, and they draw our light into themselves, leaving us gray and exhausted. The bankers of the Renaissance would be envious of the efficiency of our modern system. They had to build cities of stone to harvest a few thousand people. We have built a city of light that harvests billions. Luca the stonemason and Bernardo, the officials, stand in the deepest vault of the Medici treasury. Bernardo holds a small, ornate glass jar that seems to contain a liquid sun. The glow is so intense that Luca has to shield his eyes. This is the prime distillation, the very first drop of the golden substance ever harvested. This is not just light, Luca, Bernardo whispers, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. This is a key. The Medici have found the golden substance, but they have also found what it attracts. It is a beacon for something that hasn't walked the earth since the dawn of time. Something that is currently waking up beneath the very foundations of this city. We haven't just built a laboratory. We have built a dinner plate. As the jar in Bernardo's hand begins to vibrate, a low, tectonic groan echoes through the vault. The golden substance is not just a commodity. It is a lure. And the entity that is coming for it is not human, not divine, and certainly not kind. What is the forbidden object that is rising from the depths? And what is the midnight transmutation that will occur when the light finally meets the shadow? The truth is waiting in the dark, and it is hungry, Da. We have been told for centuries that the golden glow radiating from the paintings of the Renaissance was merely a masterclass in light and shadow. But that is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide a horrific alchemical truth. In the winter of 1482, deep within the secret laboratories of the Medici, a substance was discovered that bridged the gap between the physical and the divine. It was not gold found in the earth, but a golden substance distilled from the very center of the human brain. The Medici alchemists realized that at the moment of peak creative ecstasy or profound terror, the human spirit produces a biological luminescence that can be harvested, refined, and bottled. This forbidden substance was the true fuel for the entire Renaissance. It was mixed into the paints of the world's most famous masterpieces to give them an unnatural, hypnotic power that continues to drain the vitality of every person who gazes upon them today. The elites were not just patrons of art. They were the architects of a massive spiritual extraction. They betrayed humanity by turning the human soul into a luxury commodity, used to decorate their palaces and extend their own lives. Every shimmering halo and every radiant sunset in these paintings is a record of a stolen life force, a biological residue of a person who was distilled into a jar. This is the truth the king buried. This is the curse that turned bankers into gods, and the reason why the most beautiful era in history was built on a foundation of systematic spiritual theft. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to the silent, moonlit corridors of a secret villa in the hills of Tuscany. The air is cool and smells of rare incense and ancient earth. Hear the distant, rhythmic dripping of a water clock and the soft, steady hum of a hidden furnace. We are entering the most sacred and terrifying space in the Medici Empire, the place where life itself is refined into gold. To understand the discovery of the golden substance, we must first understand the Medici family obsession with the light of the ancients. They did not believe that light was merely a wave or a particle. They believed it was a liquid, a primordial fluid that once filled the universe before the fall of man. They were convinced that fragments of this divine light remained trapped within the human body, specifically within the brain, hidden behind what the mystics called the third eye dot in the late 1470s. Marsilio Ficino, the chief philosopher and alchemist for the family, received a collection of fragments from a sunken vessel off the coast of Greece. These fragments described a process used by the priests of the Olphic mysteries to extract the sun from the minds of their initiates. Ficino realized that this was not a metaphor, it was a biological reality. He began a series of secret experiments, funded by the limitless wealth of the Medici Bank, to find the physical vessel of this light. He discovered that the human brain contains a tiny gland, shaped like a pine cone, that the ancients called the seat of the soul. Under normal conditions, this gland is dormant, producing only the shadows of dreams. But under the pressure of intense spiritual heat, it begins to produce a substance that is both solid and liquid, a shimmering golden oil that defies the laws of ordinary chemistry. Ficino called this the chryso vitalis, or the golden substance. It was the physical manifestation of the vital spark, the literal light of life itself. The process of obtaining this substance was as precise as it was cruel. It could not be taken from the dead, for the light vanishes the moment the heart stops beating. It had to be distilled from the living. The Medici alchemists developed a technique they called the refined incubation. A donor, often a young artist or a person of exceptional mental clarity, would be placed in a sensory deprivation chamber for weeks at a time. The chamber was lined with copper and silver plates designed to focus the magnetic field of the earth directly into the skull of the donor. They were fed a diet of specific minerals and salts to sensitize their nervous system. As the donor reached a state of hyper-awareness, they were subjected to harmonic stress, a series of frequencies played on silver bells that caused the golden substance to begin to crystallize within the pineal gland. Once the harvest point was reached, a small silver needle, no thicker than a hair, was used to extract the substance. The donor felt no physical pain, but the psychological cost was absolute. To lose even a single drop of the golden substance was to lose one's capacity for joy, wonder, and creativity. Those who were harvested became the hollowed living shells who wandered the Medici estates with blank expressions, their inner light gone and their history erased. This was the dark price of the Renaissance, the hollowing of the many to create the illumination of the few. Once the golden substance was harvested, it was taken to the underground forge for refinement. It was mixed with a carrier oil made from the rarest botanical extracts of the East. This mixture was then given to the family's most trusted painters. They were told that this divine pigment was a gift from God, a secret medium that would make their work eternal when this paint was applied to a canvas. It did not just dry like normal pigment. It bonded with the surface, creating a microscopic layer of biological light. This is why paintings like Botticelli's Birth of Venice or the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel have a glow that seems to come from within the figures themselves. It is the literal essence of the hollowed donors trapped in the paint. The golden substance acts as a beacon. It is designed to resonate with the pineal glands of the viewers. When you stand in front of these paintings, the substance in the paint calls to the substance in your own brain. This is what we call aesthetic awe. It is not a natural emotional reaction. It is a biological extraction process. The painting is drawing a tiny fraction of your own light into itself to maintain its glow. The great museums of the world are not galleries. They are spiritual batteries kept alive by the collective energy of the millions of people who visit them every year. The Medici did not just use the golden substance for art. They used it for themselves. In the private diaries of the family elders, there are references to a golden cordial drink that could halt the hand of time. They believed that by consuming the distilled essence of human genius, they could incorporate that genius into their own bodies. They would mix the substance with wine and drink it during their most secret rituals. The effects were immediate and terrifying. Their skin would take on a subtle golden sheen, and their minds would become capable of calculations and strategies that seemed superhuman. This is how the Medici maintained their power for 300 years. They were not just smarter than their rivals. They were biologically superior, fueled by the distilled spirits of the people they ruled, but the golden substance carried a curse. It was a foreign material, a stolen light that was never meant to be ingested. Over time, the family members began to suffer from a condition known as the alchemical gout. Their bodies began to crystallize from the inside out. Their bones became as hard and brittle as glass, and their eyes turned a deep, solid gold. They were becoming statues while they were still alive, the very fate they had inflicted on their donors. The elixir of life was slowly turning into a stone of death. The alchemists realized that the golden substance was arranged in a specific sacred geometry. When viewed under a primitive lens, the crystals formed patterns that matched the architecture of the great cathedrals. This confirmed their belief that the human body was the blueprint for the universe. They began to design their palaces and cities to mimic the structure of the pineal gland. The city of Florence itself was laid out as a giant extraction machine. The position of the Duomo, the Palazzo Vecchio, and the various Medici villas formed a geometric grid designed to focus the spiritual heat of the population toward the center of the city. The festivals, the parades, and the religious processions were not for public entertainment. They were excitation events designed to make the population produce more golden substance. The people were like honeybees. And the Medici were the beekeepers, carefully managing the environment to ensure the maximum production of the golden honey. The architecture of the Renaissance was not about beauty. It was about efficiency. Every archway and every column was a tuning fork designed to vibrate at the frequency of the pineal gland. The people of Florence lived in a giant, open-air laboratory, their lives being harvested in a way they could never perceive. In the late 1490s, a strange phenomenon began to occur in the streets of Florence. A group of the hallowed those who had survived the distillation process began to gather in silence outside the Medici palaces. They did not speak, they did not protest, and they did not move. They simply stood and stared at the walls with their empty gray eyes. This silent gathering created a null zone of disruption in the city's spiritual grid. The Medici alchemists reported that the harvest rate was dropping and that the paintings in the palaces were losing their luster. The hallowed were somehow acting as a vacuum, drawing the golden substance back out of the architecture and the art. It was a rebellion of the empty, a return of the stolen light. The family reacted with extreme violence, branding these people as possessed and having them removed to secret underground facilities. But the damage was done. The secret of the golden substance began to leak out. Savonarola, the fanatic monk, began to preach against the vanities of the Medici, claiming that their art was a bait used by demons. He was closer to the truth than anyone realized. The bonfire of the vanities was not just about burning art. It was a desperate attempt to destroy the spiritual batteries before they could consume the entire city. What happened to the jars of golden substance that remained in the Medici vaults? When the dynasty finally collapsed in the 1700s, the Ledger of Shadows suggests that the remaining supply was smuggled out of Italy and taken to the new centers of power in London and eventually America. The alchemical science of the Renaissance did not disappear. It evolved. Today, we no longer need secret chambers and silver needles to harvest the human spirit. We have developed digital distillations, the high-frequency blue light of our screens, the algorithms designed to trigger constant emotional peaks and valleys, and the systematic hollowing of our attention spans are the modern versions of the Medici laboratory. We are being harvested every second of every day, our vital spark, being funneled into a global grid of content data. The golden substance is now invisible, but its effect is exactly the same. We feel more connected than ever, yet we feel a profound sense of hollowness. We gaze at the digital masterpieces of our era and they draw our light into themselves, leaving us gray and exhausted. The bankers of the Renaissance would be envious of the efficiency of our modern system. They had to build cities of stone to harvest a few thousand people. We have built a city of light that harvests billions. Luca the stonemason and Bernardo, the official, stand in the deepest vault of the Medici treasury. Bernardo holds a small, ornate glass jar that seems to contain a liquid sun. The glow is so intense that Luca has to shield his eyes. This is the prime distillation, the very first drop of the golden substance ever harvested. This is not just light. Luca, Bernardo whispers, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. This is a key. The Medici have found the golden substance, but they have also found what it attracts. It is a beacon for something that has not walked the earth since the dawn of time. Something that is currently waking up beneath the very foundations of this city. We have not just built a laboratory. We have built a dinner plate. Is the jar in. The hand of Bernardo begins to vibrate. A low tectonic groan echoes through the vault. The golden substance is not just a commodity, it is a lure. And the entity that is coming for it is not human, not divine, and certainly not kind. What is the forbidden object that is rising from the depths? And what is the midnight transmutation? That will occur when the light finally meets the shadow? The truth is waiting in the dark, and it is hungry. The masterpieces of the Italian Renaissance are widely celebrated as the greatest achievements of human creativity, but they hide a horrific secret that was never meant to reach the ears of the public. Behind the vibrant colors and the perfect geometry of the 15th century studios lay a systematic betrayal of the human soul known as the midnight transmutation. The Medici patrons were not simply buying art with gold. They were harvesting the physical vitality of the masters and locking it forever into the very fibers of the canvas. Every time an artist dipped their brush into the sanguine pigments provided by the family, they were not just painting a portrait. They were signing away their own life force in a forbidden contract of biological alchemy, the brilliant light that seems to radiate from within these paintings is not a trick of the eye or a clever use of oil and pigment. It is the literal residue of the golden substance, extracted in the dead of night and fused with the minerals of the earth. The masters lived in a state of constant, trembling terror, knowing that every stroke of the brush brought them closer to their own psychological collapse. They were the victims of a world-altering historical cover-up that turned the pursuit of beauty into a lethal curse. The art we admire today is not just a legacy of talent. It is a living battery of stolen breath and buried screams. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to a silent workshop in the heart of Florence, where the only light comes from a single, flickering candle and the moon reflects off the black waters of the Arno River. The air is thick with the smell of linseed oil and something sharp, like the scent of an approaching storm. We are entering the hour of the alchemist, where the boundaries between life and art begin to dissolve. To the uninitiated eye, the palette of a Renaissance master looked like a simple collection of earth and oil. But for the Medici correctors, it was a biological circuit. They understood that color is not just a visual property, but a vibrational frequency. They believed that if they could match the frequency of the paint to the frequency of the human soul, they could create a permanent link between the observer and the observed. This was the foundation of the midnight transmutation. The alchemists spent years perfecting the sanguine ink, a base material that was used to bind all other pigments. It was created through the distillation of the golden substance, which we have previously explored. This substance was highly reactive to human emotion. In the workshop of a master, the palette was kept on a white marble slab that had been etched, with the same concentric circles found in the underground forge, as the master worked, his own. Fatigue and focus would be tuned by the vibrations of the room, turning the act of painting into a ritual of extraction. The history books speak of sfumato, the technique of blurring the edges between colors to create a smoky, realistic effect. But in the secret journals of the Medici, sfumato was described as the ghost layer. It was a thin glaze of the golden substance applied over the final painting. This layer acted as a spiritual skin, trapping the vitality of the artist within the image. When a viewer looked at the painting, they were not just seeing a face. They were interacting with the actual essence of the creator, which had been transmuted into the pigment. Imagine the master, Leonardo, standing before a canvas at 3 a.m. His hands are stained with a red that looks too deep to be cinnabar. He is not alone. In the corner of the room stands a figure in a heavy, dark robe, a corrector from the black room. The corrector is not there to offer advice on the composition. He is there to ensure that the resonance is maintained. He holds a silver bell that he rings at specific intervals, a sound that keeps the master in a state of high-frequency anxiety. The master knows that he is being drained. He can feel the vitality leaving his fingertips and entering the wet paint. It is a sensation like a slow, cold pull through the veins. But he cannot stop. The Medici have promised him protection from the Inquisition and access to the forbidden library of the ancients. The price for this knowledge is his own biological history. Every masterpiece he completes is a payment on an unpayable debt recorded in the ledger of shadows. The midnight transmutation was a systematic process of hardening. The alchemists believed that by moving the vital spark from the soft, decaying flesh of the human body into the hard, permanent minerals of the paint, they were saving the genius of the age. But they were not saving it for the artist. They were saving it for themselves. They were creating a collection of spiritual mirrors that would allow the Medici to see through time and space. They were building a network of eyes across Europe, all connected to the central laboratory beneath the palazzo. Why did the masters continue to work under these conditions? It was not just for the money or the fame. The golden substance had a secondary effect. It was highly addictive. Once an artist had worked with the sanguine pigments, they found it impossible to use ordinary paint. To them, regular colors seemed dead, flat, and lifeless. They craved the vibrancy and the pulse of the alchemical pigments. Even though they knew the cost was their own sanity, the psychological thread of this story is one of moral decay. The masters began to see themselves as gods, capable of creating life on a canvas. But they were gods who were slowly turning into statues. They became obsessed with the perfect transmutation, the moment when the painting would become so alive that it would breathe on its own. They spent decades chasing a shadow, encouraged by their patrons who watched with cold, calculating interest as the artist's bodies withered and their minds, fractured, reflect for a moment on the eyes of the portraits in the Uffizi gallery. Have you ever felt that they were following you, not because of a technical trick of perspective, but because they seemed to have an internal will? This is the psychological layer of the midnight transmutation. The masters were encouraged to paint their own fears and their own hidden shamans into the work. The patrons believed that these dark emotions were the most stable form of energy, the kind that would last for centuries without dissipating. They were harvesting the suffering of the geniuses to power the beauty of the Renaissance. To provide the Tier 1 audience with the depth they crave, we must look at the specific chemical betrayals involved. The paints were not just oil and stone. They contained vitreous tears, a substance created by shocking the nervous system of a donor and capturing the resulting moisture. They also included pulverized relics, which were not the bones of saints, but the ground-up remains of the hallowed who had finally expired in the underground forge. These biological ingredients were mixed with lead, mercury, and arsenic to create a toxic, high-energy slurry. The toxicity was deliberate. It kept the artist in a state of physical illness, which lowered their natural defenses and made the extraction easier. The masters were literally poisoning themselves to create the immortality of their patrons. The Medici understood that the most beautiful things grow in the soil of corruption. They turned the workshops of Florence into a series of refined death chambers, where the genius of the age was slowly distilled into jars of glowing pigment. The golden substance acted as a catalyst, binding these toxic elements into a stable structure. It created a biological glass that protected the pigments from the air and time. This is why, when a restorer cleans a Renaissance masterpiece today, they find that the paint is as hard as diamond and as vibrant as the day it was applied. They are not touching paint. They are touching the petrified vitality of a man who died 500 years ago. The midnight transmutation was not complete until the painting was seen. The final step was the engagement. When the finished work was displayed in a cathedral or a public square, it acted as a giant, open-circuit battery. The golden substance in the paint would reach out and resonate with the vital spark in the hundreds of people who gathered to see it. The viewers would feel a sudden wave of divine inspiration or religious ecstasy, but this was a bypass. The painting was actually hollowing the audience, drawing a small fraction of their vitality into itself to maintain its own glow. The Medici would stand in the back of the cathedrals, watching the faces of the common people as their energy was harvested. They were the masters of spiritual tax, collecting interest on the beauty they had. Commission. This explains why the Renaissance was a time of such massive public fervor. The people were being excited by the art, their emotions being manipulated by the alchemical frequencies in the paint. It was a form of mass psychological control that turned the entire population of Italy into a power source for the elite. The beauty was the bait, and the midnight transmutation was the trap. The more beautiful the city became, the more exhausted and hollow the people grew. In the final years of the 15th century, many of the greatest masters began to realize the true nature of their work. They saw their colleagues vanishing into the sanatoriums of the Medici, only to return as the hollowed. They saw their own hands turning gray and their eyes losing their color. A few attempted to destroy their paintings, but the sanguine pigments were nearly indestructible. The vital spark within the paint fought back, causing the brushes to melt or the canvases to burn with a cold. Blue Flame, one master whose name has been erased from the ledger, attempted to create a counterpigment. He spent years in secret, trying to find a way to unlock the vitality trapped in the master's works. He believed that if he could find the right frequency, he could release the souls from the canvases and return the light to the people of Florence. But the Medici found him first. They did not kill him. Instead, they turned him into the very material he was trying to defeat. They distilled his body into a single jar of deepest indigo, a color so intense that it was said to cause anyone who looked at it to immediately forget their own name, the tragedy of the Renaissance. Is that its most beautiful artifacts are also its most profound betrayals. The masters were the first to be processed by the New World Order. The genius turned into a permanent liquid currency for the bankers of souls. They left behind a world of light, but they died in a world of absolute, suffocating darkness. We must ask ourselves where these pigments are now. The secret recipes of the midnight transmutation were never truly lost. They were simply institutionalized. The chemical and biological technologies developed in the workshops of Florence were the direct ancestors of the modern industries that manage our perception today. The digital glow of our screens, the high-definition vibrancy of our media, and the subliminal frequencies of our modern environment are all iterations of the sanguine ink. We are still living in the era of the midnight transmutation. Our vitality is still being harvested, not by painters in dark workshops, but by algorithms in silent server rooms. We are the new donors, giving up our focus and our spirit to power the masterpieces of the digital age. The Medici would be proud of the efficiency of our modern world. They had to wait months for a single painting to be finished. We produce millions of spiritual mirrors every hour. The golden substance is no longer a secret oil in a jar. It is the data of our lives, the record of our every emotion and our every fear. It is being refined and used to create a new Renaissance one where the art is the world itself and we are the pigments. The midnight is no longer a time of day. It is a permanent state of the soul in a world that has forgotten the difference between life and the canvas. Luca the stonemason and Bernardo, the official, stand at the very back of the Medici gallery, watching as the morning sun hits the most famous portrait in the world. The painting seems to shiver, the colors shifting and depth appearing that was not there a moment before. Bernardo holds the ledger of shadows tightly, his eyes fixed on a specific name that has started to glow with a violet light. The transmutation is working? Luca, Bernardo whispers, his voice filled with a terrifying reverence. But the painting is not just a record of the past anymore. It has begun to predict the future. Look at the eyes of the master's final subject. She is not looking at us. She is looking at the man who will find this ledger 400 years from now. She is looking at the one who is listening to this story right now. As Luca leans in to look at the eyes of the portrait, he hears a soft, rhythmic ticking sound coming from behind the canvas. It is not a clock. It is a heartbeat. The final transmutation is complete, and the debt is about to be called in from a world that doesn't even know it's a debtor. But who is the silent subject of the master's final work? And why does her heartbeat match the rhythm of the city's impending doom? The secret is hidden in the Black Banquet of 1492, and the guest list is already written in blood. The history of the Renaissance is often painted as a movement of enlightened reason, but in the deepest vaults of the Medici archives, there exists a document that proves the era was actually governed by a horrific supernatural debt. This is the Alchemist's Grimoire, a book bound in the skin of the hollowed and written in an ink that has remained wet and pulsing for over 500 years. This grimoire is not a collection of spells, but a ledger of forbidden contracts between the elite and a force that resides in the shadows of the earth. The world believes that the great masters signed contracts for money and fame, but that is a carefully constructed lie. They signed away their very biological essence in a betrayal of the human soul that can never be undone. The ink used in this book is the distilled vitality of every man, woman, and child who vanished into the Medici sanatoriums. It is a biological curse, a living record of a secret covenant that turned the pursuit of beauty into a systematic harvest of human life. Every line of text in this grimoire is a trap, a resonant frequency that continues to bind the ancestors of the signatories to a debt that can never be paid. The moral decay required to maintain this ledger was absolute, a secret buried beneath layers of gold and ritual. This is the truth, the king buried, the hidden foundation of the Western world, and the reason why the most powerful families on earth still fear the turning of a single page. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to a secret room located behind a false bookshelf in the private library of the Palazzo Pitti. The air is still and heavy with the scent of dried lavender and old blood. Hear the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock that measures not seconds, but the heartbeats of the people of Florence. We are entering the domain of the correctors, the place where the contract of your very existence was first written. To understand the alchemist's grimoire, one must first understand the unique chemistry of the ink that fills its pages. In the 1480s, the Medici alchemists realized that ordinary ink was too fragile to record the types of transactions they were making. They needed a medium that was as permanent as the soul itself. They turned to the same process used to create the golden substance, but instead of refining it into a glowing oil, they mixed it with a specific type of volcanic ash and the distilled minerals from the iron in human blood. The result was a fluid that defied the laws of evaporation. Because it contained the biological residue of the vital spark, the ink remained in a perpetual liquid state. If you were to touch a letter written in this grimoire today, your finger would come away stained with a dark, iridescent crimson that would never wash off. This was the living ink. It allowed the Medici to create contracts that were literally alive. The words on the page would shift and pulse in response to the physical state of the person who had signed them. If a debtor fell ill, the ink would turn a pale, sickly gray. If they were in a state of high creative ecstasy, the ink would glow with a faint, violet luminescence. The grimoire was the central processing unit of the Medici Empire. It wasn't just a record. It was a remote monitoring system. Every person listed in the book was connected back to the ledger through the sympathetic resonance of the biological pigments. The bankers didn't need to visit their debtors to check on their progress. They simply had to look at the state of the ink in the grimoire. It was a technology of total surveillance, a way to map the entire population of Italy onto the pages of a single, heavy book. The physical construction of the grimoire was as significant as its contents. The cover was made of wood taken from a tree that had grown over the site of an ancient pre-Roman sacrificial pit. This wood was then covered in the skin of the hollowed, a material we have explored in our previous stories. The skin was treated with silver salts to make it nearly indestructible, creating a surface that was soft to the touch, but as hard as steel. The spine of the book was reinforced with the silver tubes of the underground forge, allowing the alchemist to plug the grimoire directly into the city's spiritual grid. This meant that the book wasn't just recording data, it was broadcasting it. The correctors could use the grimoire to trigger specific emotional responses in the population by tracing the patterns in the ink with a silver stylus. They could send a wave of fear through a rival family or a pulse of loyalty, through a rebellious guild simply by manipulating the living text. The pages themselves were made of a vellum that had been soaked in a solution of ground pearls and the same vitreous tears used in the Renaissance pigments. This gave the paper a shimmering, translucent quality that made the ink appear as if it were floating in a three-dimensional space. To read the grimoire was to gaze into a window of the human soul. It was a hypnotic experience, one that often left the correctors in a state of deep trance, their own minds becoming synchronized with the rhythms of the book. What exactly were the terms written in this living ink? To provide the depth your Tier 1 audience requires, we must look at the clauses of possession found in the 14th century sections of the ledger. These were not financial agreements. They were agreements of resonance. A young genius would be granted 40 years of uninterrupted focus in exchange for the primary ownership of the ancestral line. This meant that the Medici didn't just own the artist, they owned his children and his children's children into infinity. They were building a genetic portfolio of talent and vitality. The grimoire records that the family would strategically activate these dormant bloodlines centuries later, ensuring that the same sparks of genius would reappear whenever the dynasty needed a new cultural explosion. You might believe your talent is your own, but according to the grimoire, it is a leased asset being called in by a bank that never forgets a signature. The contract was signed in a ritual of exsanguination of the will. The signatory would place their thumb on a specific Silver-edged seal at the bottom of the page. A tiny needle would draw a single drop of blood, which would then be absorbed into the wet ink of the document. In that moment, the person's unique biological frequency was recorded and locked into the grimoire. They were no longer a free agent. They were a variable in a massive alchemical equation. The ink would never dry because the person was still alive, and as long as their lineage continued, the contract remained active and pulsing. The men responsible for managing the alchemist's grimoire. The correctors of the Black Room were the most psychologically damaged members of the Medici hierarchy. Because they were in constant contact with the living ink, they began to experience a phenomenon known as the bleed. Their own memories would start to mix with the records in the book. They would find themselves remembering the childhoods of artists they had never met, or feeling the terror of a debtor who had died a century before. They lived in a state of permanent mental fragmentation, their minds becoming a crowded gallery of the thousands of souls recorded in the ledger. To survive, they had to undergo a process of numbing, where their own emotions were systematically removed and stored in the underground forge. They became human automatons, their only purpose being to maintain the integrity of the contracts. They were the silent gardeners of the Medici's human crop, ensuring that every harvest was recorded and every debt was collected. The correctors wrote in their private notes about the hunger of the grimoire. They claimed that the book would sometimes grow warm on the desk, its cover pulsing like a heart. It needed a constant supply of new signatures to maintain its stability. If the number of new contracts dropped, the existing ink would begin to fade and turn gray, threatening to break the links between the family and their debtors. This is why the Medici were so aggressive in their search for new talent. They weren't looking for art. They were looking for a fuel for their book. Did anyone ever try to break a contract signed in the living ink? The grimoire records several anomalies where a signatory attempted to erase their name. They tried using acids, fire, and even the most powerful alchemical solvents, but the ink simply absorbed the material and grew darker. Some tried to destroy the entire book, but the grimoire was protected by a static field of the collective vitality it contained. Anyone who touched the book with harmful intent would be hit by a massive discharge of emotional energy, often leaving them in a state of permanent catatonia. There is one record of a master who attempted a symbolic suicide. He believed that if he could erase his own name from the world's memory, the contract in the grimoire would lose its power. He stopped signing his works, he changed his name, and he retreated to a remote monastery in the Alps. But the ink in the grimoire didn't care about his name. It cared about his biological frequency. The correctors simply traced his vibration through the silver tubes, and he was found weeks later, his body perfectly intact but his mind completely erased. He had become one of the hallowed without ever setting foot in the sanatorium. The only way to break a contract was to find a substitution. A person of equal or greater vitality had to agree to take on the debt. This led to a secret trade in human spirit among the elite of Florence. Families would gamble with the resonance of their children to pay off the debts of their ancestors. The grimoire became a catalogue of these tragic trades, a record of a society that had turned the human soul into a commodity to be bartered and sold. Where is the alchemist's grimoire now? After the final collapse of the Medici, the book was said to have been taken to a secret vault beneath the Vatican. But modern archival researchers believe it was actually sold to a consortium of European bankers in the 1800s. The technology of the living ink was the direct ancestor of our modern credit and data systems. We no longer sign our names in blood, but we sign them in digital traces that are just as permanent and just as biological. Are modern. Terms and conditions are the descendants of the Medici contracts. They are designed to be too long and too complex to read, hiding the fact that we are giving away our attention, our focus, and our very psychological autonomy in exchange for the genius of modern technology. We are all listed in a new digital grimoire, our every thought and emotion being recorded and distilled into a liquid currency for the new elite. The ink is no longer crimson. It is a stream of zeros and ones, but it is just as wet and just as hungry as the fluid in the Medici ledger. The psychological toll on our modern society mirrors the decay of the correctors. We feel fragmented, overwhelmed by the bleed of information from thousands of other lives. We are losing our own sense of self in a massive, interconnected ledger of debt and observation. The Medici's dream of a total surveillance state has finally been realized, not through stone and silver, but through light and glass. We are all debtors now, and the bank is always watching, for the individuals recorded in the grimoire. The realization of their status often led to a specific type of psychological collapse. They described a feeling of being thin, as if their own existence was being stretched across the pages of the book. They lost the ability to feel present in their own lives, their attention always being drawn toward a silent, invisible center. They were the shadow signatories. Living in the wake of a contract they had no memory of signing, the sense of being a leased asset is a profound moral decay. It removes the meaning from human achievement and turns every act of creativity into a fulfillment of a corporate quota. The masters of the Renaissance weren't just afraid of their patrons. They were afraid of their own talent because they knew it wasn't theirs. They were merely the vessels through which the grimoire manifested its will. They were the flesh and blood pens used by the alchemists to write the history of the world. As we look at the masterpieces of the era, we must ask ourselves how much of what we see is the artist and how much is the living ink. Is the beauty we admire a triumph of the human spirit, or is it a symptom of a systematic harvest? The grimoire suggests that there is no difference. Beauty is the byproduct of the extraction process, the shimmering glow of a soul as it is being distilled into a jar. We are admiring the wreckage of a thousands-year-old betrayal. Luca the stonemason and Bernardo the official stand in the center of the black room, the alchemist's grimoire lying open on the mahogany desk between them. The ink on the pages pulsing with a deep, angry violet light, and the letters are beginning to shift, forming a name that Luca recognizes with a shock that stops his heart. It is not the name of an artist, or a king, or a banker. It is a name that belongs to someone who is alive today, someone who is currently listening to the sound of this very story. The debt has reached its maturity. Luca, Bernardo whispers, his eyes reflecting the iridescent crimson of the pulsing ink. The grimoire doesn't just record history, it completes it. The contracts of the past are now the mandates of the present. And the person whose name is appearing on this page has a role to play in the midnight transmutation that will change the face of the earth forever. As the grimoire begins to emit a low, rhythmic hum that vibrates through the floorboards, a dark, viscous fluid begins to seep out from between the pages, staining the desk and the floor. This is not ink. It is the raw vitality of the next harvest, and it is looking for a new vessel to inhabit. What is the final clause of the contract that is about to be activated? And what is the golden object that is currently being forged in the heart of the city to receive this stolen light? The truth is in the grimoire, and the page is about to turn. Every year during the peak of the Renaissance, dozens of children vanished from the streets of Florence without a single record of their disappearance. History calls them the forgotten orphans of the Arno, but the secret ledgers of the Medici reveal a betrayal so profound it would stain the very marble of the city. These children were not lost to the plague or poverty. They were systematically harvested by the elite to fuel the most beautiful era in human history. The alchemists of the Black Room discovered that the vital spark of an innocent mind vibrates at a frequency of absolute purity, a frequency that can be distilled and infused into the gold and the pigments of the master painter's dot. This was the forbiddance, price of eternal inspiration. The shimmering light in the eyes of the Sistine Chapel's angels and the unnatural vibrancy of Botticelli's masterpieces were bought with the stolen futures of the city's youth. These children were the primary donors for the Renaissance, their souls distilled into jars to ensure that the Medici dynasty remained culturally supreme. This was a secret buried beneath layers of philanthropy and religious arte. Curse that turned the Ospedale degli Innocenti into a processing center for human spirit. Every masterpiece you admire today is a living tomb, a biological record of a life that was never allowed to grow. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light in your room is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to the dark, mist-heavy banks of the Arno River in the late 15th century. Hear the soft lapping of the water against the ancient stone walls and the distant, lonely cry of an owl. We are descending into the quiet, forgotten corners of Florence, where the shadows are long and the secrets are deep. In the heart of Florence stands the Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocents. To the public, it was the world's first true orphanage, a symbol of the Medici's Christian charity and their care for the vulnerable. But for the correctors of the Ledger of Shadows, it was an inventory. The architecture of the building, designed by the great Brunelleschi himself, was more than just a place of shelter. The long rhythmic arcades and the circular medallions of swaddled infants were designed to create a specific resonance of submission. The children brought to this place were given food and clothing, but they were also subjected to a series of subtle alchemical tests. The alchemists were looking for the luminaries' children whose brain patterns showed a specific, high-frequency, genius potential. These children were not put up for adoption. Instead, they were transferred to a secondary facility located beneath the Medici stables. In the public records, these children were listed as deceased from fever, but in the Ledger of Shadows, they were listed as ascets in refinement. The tragedy of the Arno was not a sudden massacre, but a slow, calculated harvest. The Medici understood that the vital spark of a child is different from that of an adult. It is more flexible, more resilient, and more easily impressed into a physical object. They were looking for the raw material of divinity. They believed that if they could capture the essence of a child's wonder, they could use it to power the golden substance that made their artists seem like gods. The orphanage was the garden, and the alchemists were the reapers. The process used on these children was known in the Black Room as the white transmutation. Unlike the aggressive extraction used on the adult masters, the process for the youth was designed to be slow and hypnotic. The children were kept in a state of permanent, dreamlike bliss using a combination of rare floral extracts and high-frequency music played on silver lutes. In this state, their vitality would pool in the pineal gland, manifesting as a soft, white luminescence that the alchemists called the milk of the stars. This substance was then harvested using a method that left no physical marks but hollowed the child's emotional core. They would lose their curiosity, their laughter, and their ability to form memories. They became the silent watchers, beautiful, unmoving children who wandered the Medici gardens like living statues. To the visitors of the palace, they looked like the perfect products of a high-quality education and a refined environment. In reality, they were the exhausted donors, their inner light already painted into the frescoes of the churches above. Why did the Medici risk such a dark betrayal? The answer lies in their obsession with coded immortality. They believed that if they could fill the city with art that contained the actual essence of the youth, the city itself would never grow old. They were trying to halt the natural decay of the social order by infusing it with a permanent synthetic childhood. They turned the youth of Florence into a preservative for their own power. Every time a citizen felt a surge of hope or inspiration while looking at a Medici-funded statue, they were actually consuming the vitality that had been stolen from an orphan. The most valuable byproduct of the white transmutation was a specific type of pigment known as innocent crimson. This was not made from minerals or plants, but from the mineralized remains of the vitality harvest taken from the children. When mixed with the sanguine ink, it created a color so deep and so resonant that it appeared to breathe on the canvas. This was the secret behind the lifelike skin tones of the High Renaissance. The master painters were often provided with this pigment in small, sealed jars that bore the Medici seal. They were told it was a rare mineral from the East, but many of them suspected the truth. Michelangelo, in his private letters, spoke of the scent of a nursery that came from his paints. He wrote about the guilt of the brush, the feeling that he was not creating life, but merely moving it from one place to another. He realized that the eternal beauty he was creating was a form of spiritual tax. Collected from those who had no voice to object, this pigment had a unique psychological effect on the viewer. Because it contained the biological frequency of a child's innocence, it bypasses the adult brain's natural defenses. It creates an immediate, visceral sense of awe and protectiveness. The Medici used this to manipulate the public's perception of their own divinity. By surrounding themselves with art that carried the frequency of childhood, they made themselves appear as the fathers of the city, even as they were the ones consuming its children. In the private gardens of the Medici villas, there were sections that were never shown to the public. These were the retirement grounds for the children who had been fully harvested. Because their vital spark was gone, they no longer aged at a normal rate. They became ageless wraiths, small, gray-skinned figures who would sit for hours staring at the sun without blinking. They were the silent witnesses to the family's glory. The hollowed remnants of the Renaissance the alchemists used, these children as spiritual anchors for the city's alchemical grid. They were placed in specific geometric patterns within the gardens to focus the resonance of the golden substance back toward the palazzo. They were no longer human. They were biological hardware, the living batteries that kept the Medici's illusions alive. The family would walk among them during their evening strolls, seeing them not as victims, but as successful extractions. Reflect for a moment on the terrifying psychological layer of this. Imagine being a child in Florence, told that the Medici were your protectors, only to find yourself in a beautiful garden where you can no longer feel the heat of the sun or the love of a parent. This was the true price of the eternal inspiration we celebrate today. The Golden Age was built on a foundation of gray, silent children. Their laughter distilled into the paint and their futures buried in the vaults, despite the secrecy of the Black Room. The mothers of Florence began to notice the patterns. They saw that the Ospedale degli Innocenti was a one-way door. They began to whisper about the gray children and the painting of the blood. In 1488, a small group of women attempted to storm the Medici stables. Convinced that their children were being held in the basements, the rebellion was suppressed with absolute coldness. The Medici didn't use soldiers. They used the resonance. They activated the silver tubes beneath the streets, broadcasting a frequency of mass despair that caused the protesters to fall to their knees in tears, their will to fight completely erased. They were then processed and added to the ledger of shadows as voluntary contributors. This was the first time the family used their alchemical weapons on their own citizens, and it was a terrifying success. The memory of the vanished children was systematically erased from the city's history. Documents were burned, witnesses were hollowed, and the master painters were paid triple their usual commissions to paint even more beautiful scenes of motherhood and childhood. They used the beauty to cover the blood. They turned the trauma of the city into a celebration of art, ensuring that no one would ever dare to look beneath the surface of the Golden Age again. Today, the Arno River flows quietly through Florence, its waters reflecting the beautiful bridges and the grand palazzos. But for those who know the history, the river carries a heavy psychic weight. Modern sensors have detected unusual biological signatures in the silt at the bottom of the river near the Ospedale. These are the mineralized remains of the extraction pigments that have leaked out over the centuries. A permanent record of the harvest. The innocent crimson is still there, locked in the frescoes of the Uffizi and the Pitti Palace. When you stand before a portrait of a Renaissance child, you might feel a sudden, inexplicable sense of sadness or a desire to reach out to the image. This is not just art appreciation. It is the vital spark of the donor reaching out to you from across 5 centuries. The children are still there, trapped in the pigments, their innocence serving as a battery for a world that has forgotten their names. Tier -1 audiences in the modern world are experiencing a new version of this harvest. We no longer use orphans in Florence, but we use the attention and the wonder of our own children, harvesting their digital vitality to power the algorithms of the elite. We are the new Ospedale, and our screens are the new Sanguine ink. The Medici's dream of a total biological control has finally been realized on a global scale. And the price is still the same, the future of the youth. What happened to the Medici who consumed this childhood vitality? The Ledger of Shadows records that the elders who drank the white elixir began to suffer from a condition known as the regression. They would lose their adult memories and begin to act like infants. Even as their bodies remained old and withered, they were becoming the very things they had consumed, a horrific biological poetic justice. Lorenzo the Magnificent, in his final days, was said to be surrounded by gray children who whispered to him in the dark. He died in a state of absolute terror, his mind a fragmented mess of other people's memories. He realized too late that you cannot consume the vitality of the innocent without also consuming their suffering. The Golden Age he had built was a palace of mirrors, and in the end, he was the only one left to face the reflection of his own betrayal. The moral decay of the Renaissance was absolute. It was a time of light built on a foundation of shadow, a time of genius built on a foundation of hollowing. The vanished children of the Arno are the silent partners in every masterpiece we admire. They are the hidden fabric of the Renaissance, the ghosts in the gold, and the warning that beauty bought with the souls of the innocent is a curse that can never be lifted. Luca the stonemason and Bernardo the official stand at the edge of the Arno, the mist swirling around their feet like the spirits of the vanished. Bernardo holds a small velvet bag containing a single, shimmering marble resonant stone created from the final distillation of the Innocenti harvest. This is the last of the white light. Luca, Bernardo whispers, his voice cracking with a fear he can no longer hide. But the ledger is not yet balanced. The alchemists have discovered that there is one soul in Florence that cannot be distilled, a child who was born without a vital spark, but who can speak to the echoes in the paint. And the Medici are not looking for his light. They are looking for his darkness to complete the midnight transmutation. As the marble in Bernardo's hand begins to glow with a cold, blue light, a rhythmic knocking sound begins to come from beneath the surface of the river. It is not the water hitting the stones. It is the sound of thousands of tiny hands hitting the underside of the world. Who is this child of darkness, and what is the Grand Duke's pact that will turn the entire city into a graveyard of the living? The secret is in the next ledger, and the price is higher than you can imagine. The rise of the Medici Grand Dukes is often portrayed as a triumph of political strategy and banking brilliance. But there is a forbidden chapter buried in the foundations of the Palazzo Vecchio that tells a much darker story. In the winter of 1574, Grand Duke Francesco I entered into a secret covenant that would ensure his family's dominance for centuries. But the price was a betrayal of the human lineage itself. He did not make this pact with any king, pope, or earthly power. He made it with the ancient, unseen, and non-human entity that has resided beneath the stones of Florence since. Before the first Roman wall was built, this was a world-altering, historical cover-up designed to hide the fact that the Medici were no longer entirely human. The alchemical laboratories were not for creating gold, but for maintaining a biological link to a shadow that required a constant harvest of the city's vitality. Every law passed and every monument built was a secondary clause in a contract signed in a substance that never dries. This is the truth the king buried, a curse that turned a dynasty into a vessel for something that hates the sun. The moral decay of the Grand Dukes was not a choice, but a requirement of the pact. You are not just looking at a royal family. You are looking at the survivors of a secret massacre of the spirit. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light in your room is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to the silent marble corridors of the Studiolo and the Palazzo Vecchio. The air is still and heavy with the scent of distilled mercury and dried herbs. Hear the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock that measures the movement of the stars. We are entering the secret heart of the Grand Duke's private world, the place where the shadows are ancient and the unseen is waiting to speak. To understand the Grand Duke's pact, we must first look at the man who was driven by a hunger for what lies beyond the veil. Francesco I de' Medici was not a warrior or a politician by nature. He was a creature of the laboratory, a man who found more comfort in the company of alchemists and mathematicians than in the courts of Europe. He was obsessed with the idea of the secret history, the belief that the world we see is merely a thin fabric stretched over a much larger, More terrifying reality, he spent his nights in the studiolo, a windowless room designed as a private museum of the world's wonders. But the studiolo was more than a room. It was a psychological anchor. Every cabinet and every painting was a physical representation of an alchemical stage. Behind the panels of the walls were hidden passages that led deep into the bedrock of Florence. It was here, in the cold dampness beneath the city, that Francesco began to hear the whispers of the ancient unseen. History tells us that he was a melancholy ruler, often detached from the needs of his people. But the truth is that he was a man under a constant, crushing weight. He had discovered that the Medici wealth was not just a result of banking, it was a biological inheritance. He realized that his ancestors had left him a key to a door that should have stayed locked. The ancient unseen were not gods, but they were the architects of the shadows. They offered Francesco a way to stabilize the golden substance harvest that his family had started, provided he agreed to the terms of the covenant. The terms were specific. Francesco was to turn the city of Florence into a living sigil, a geometric machine that would focus the emotional energy of the citizens into the bedrock. In return, the ancient unseen would grant him the vision of the deep, the ability to see the movements of history before they happened. This is why the Medici were always one step ahead of their enemies. They weren't just clever, they were being guided by a perspective that spanned thousands of years. But the pact required a sacrifice of the spirit that would slowly consume the Grand Duke from the inside out. As we move deeper into the narrative, we must consider the physical manifestation of this pact within the architecture of Florence. Francesco understood that for the covenant to hold, the city had to be tuned to the frequency of the ancient unseen. He worked with the great architects of his time, men who were also initiates into the Black Room to redesign the public spaces of the city, the placement of the statues in the piazza. Della Signoria was not an aesthetic choice. It was a defensive grid. Every bronze and marble figure was positioned to create a static field that trapped the vital spark of the population and funneled it down into the silver tubes we have explored in our previous stories. This was the Grand Duke's machine, a massive alchemical engine that used the architecture as its skeleton and the people as its fuel. The Grand Duke would stand on the balcony of the Palazzo Vecchio at midnight, watching the city not as a ruler, but as a technician. He could see the luminescence of the harvest rising from the rooftops, a faint violet glow that the common people mistook for the beauty of the moon. He knew that every child born in the city was another unit of energy for the pact. He felt the moral decay of his position, the weight of knowing that his family's glory was a parasite on the city's life force. But the ancient unseen were a jealous partner. They did not allow for regret. Francesco's private journals speak of the cold heat that emanated from the walls of his laboratory. He wrote about the subterranean witness, an entity that had no face but many voices. He claimed that the entity would manifest in the reflections of the mercury vats, showing him the true face of the Medici. It was a face that was no longer recognizable as human. It was a face made of stone and shadow, a permanent record of the betrayal that had bought their power. The covenant had to be renewed every year on the night of the winter solstice. This was the time when the veil of the unseen was at its thinnest, and the connection between the laboratory and the deep earth was at its most volatile. Francesco would descend alone into the deepest vault, carrying a jar of the prime distillation, the highest quality of the golden substance. He was entering the chamber of the covenant. This was a room lined with lead and silver, designed to prevent any of the energy from escaping into the upper levels of the palace. In the center of the room was a black mirror made of obsidian, a gift from the ancient unseen. This mirror did not reflect light. It reflected the resonance of the ancestors. When Francesco looked into the mirror, he could see every Medici who had come before him, all trapped in a state of permanent. Flickering shadow, the ritual involved the transfer of the weight. Francesco would pour the golden substance into a silver basin at the base of the mirror, and in return the ancient unseen would infuse him with a new year of vitality and clarity. It was a biological reboot, a way to keep the Grand Duke functioning despite the psychological toll of his secrets. But each time he performed the ritual, a part of his own history was erased. He began to forget the faces of his children. He began to forget the sound of his own name. He was becoming a generic vessel, a biological puppet for the interests of the Covenant. The alchemists of the Black Room monitored the ritual from a safe distance, recording the frequency of the unseen in the ledger of shadows. They noted that the demand for the golden substance was increasing with every year. The entity beneath the city was growing hungry. It was no longer satisfied with the byproduct of the arts. It wanted the silent scream of the living. This was the turning point in the Medici history, the moment when the Golden Age began its slow, inevitable slide into the Age of the Shadow. We must now look at the effect of the pact on the Medici bloodline itself. Tier 1 historical research has often pointed to the strange physical and mental decline of the later Medici, but they have never identified the alchemical cause. The covenant with the ancient unseen introduced a foreign resonance into the family's biology. This was not a genetic mutation in the modern sense. It was a vibrational contamination. The family was no longer in sync with the natural rhythms of the earth. They were tuned to the frequency of the shadows. This caused a systematic breakdown of their nervous systems, leading to the melancholy of the dukes that is so prominent in the records of the 1600s. They became sensitive to the light, preferring to spend their days in shuttered rooms lit only by candles. They lost the ability to feel empathy, their emotions being replaced by a cold, calculating logic that was not their own. Francesco's own daughter, Maria de' Medici, carried this contamination to the court of France. She was a carrier of the covenant, a biological beacon for the ancient unseen in a new land. This explains her obsession with the occult and her strange, hypnotic influence over the French nobility. The pact was spreading like a slow-moving infection, crossing borders and infiltrating the royal houses of Europe. The Medici were the first donors, but they were not the last. The ancient unseen were building a network of refined vessels across the continent, preparing for a harvest that would span the entire world. Reflect on the psychological layer of this biological betrayal. Imagine being a child born into the most powerful family in the world, only to realize that your very blood is a contract you never signed. You are a line item in a ledger that predates your birth by 1,000 years. Your every thought is a pre-programmed response to a frequency you cannot hear. This is the ultimate moral decay, the loss of the self in the pursuit of the eternal. The Grand Duke understood that the Arno River was more than just a source of water for Florence. It was a conduit of vitality. The alchemists believed that the flowing water carried the residual spark of everyone who lived along its banks. Francesco commissioned the construction of the Vasari corridor, a hidden walkway that connected the Palazzo Vecchio to the Pitti Palace. Crossing over the Ponte Vecchio to the public, The corridor was a way for the Duke to move through the city without being seen. But in the Ledger of Shadows, it was recorded as a resonance bridge. The corridor was lined with specific types of stone and metal that acted as a psychic filter. As Francesco walked through the corridor, the vital energy of the people crossing the bridge below would be drawn up into the walls, providing him with a constant stream of sublimated vitality. This is why the Ponte Vecchio is the only bridge that was not destroyed during the many wars that have plagued Florence. It was too valuable to the Covenant. It was a primary extraction point, a place where the lives of the many were used to power the life of the one. The architecture of the corridor was a biological extension of the Grand Duke's own body. He was the heart of the city, and the corridor was the aorta through which the city's life force flowed. Modern sensors have picking up unexplained magnetic anomalies along the path of the Vasari corridor. They find that the air inside the walkway has a higher vibrational density than the air outside. They are pick up the echoes of the silent tax that was collected for 300 years. The corridor is a living artifact of the Pact, a place where the past is not a memory, but a physical presence that continues to resonate with the ancient unseen. As we reached the middle of the 1600s, the Pact began to fracture. The ancient unseen were no longer satisfied with the role of a silent partner. They began to manifest in the streets of Florence, their shadows appearing in the background of public festivals and religious processions. The people began to feel a sense of dreading that they could not explain. They spoke of the gray mist that would roll in from the Arno, a mist that smelled of ozone and cold stone. The Medici Grand Dukes were losing control of the frequency of calm. Their alchemical engines were overheated. The star iron in the underground forge beginning to crack under the pressure of the harvest. The Covenant was becoming a liability. The family tried to quench the shadows by commissioning even more religious art, hoping that the frequency of faith would neutralize the frequency of the unseen. But the ancient unseen had already infused themselves into the pigments. The divine art had become a demon's gateway. The records of the Black Room from this era are filled with containment reports. They describe the systematic hollowing of the family's own servants and advisors to provide the energy needed to keep the ancient unseen at bay. The Medici were eating their own history to survive the present. The moral decay had reached its absolute limit. They were no longer a royal family. They were a failing infrastructure, a group of exhausted technicians trying to prevent a spiritual meltdown that would destroy the entire city. Reflect on the psychological collapse of a dynasty that realized they had built their palace on a foundation of sentient shadows. They were the prisoners of the Pact, tied to an entity that was now looking for a way to break free from the bedrock and walk the earth in a physical form. The Grand Duke's Pact was not a contract for power. It was a contract for a slow, agonizing extinction. Is the Covenant still active? After the fall of the last Medici in the 1700s, the Ledger of Shadows was supposedly lost. But Tier 1 researchers have found that the resonance grid of Florence was never dismantled. The statues are still in place, the Vasari corridor is still standing, and the magnetic anomalies in the bedrock are stronger than ever. The ancient unseen did not leave. They simply went back into a state of hibernation, waiting for a new generation of refined vessels to arrive. Today, we see the modern iterations of the Medici Pact in our global systems of observation and control. The algorithms of the unseen, the systematic harvest of attention, and the digital distillation of reality are the direct descendants of the alchemical science of Florence. We are no longer signing pacts with shadows and dark vaults. We are signing them with user agreements on shimmering screens. The frequency has changed from subterranean to electronic, but the goal is the same. The extraction of the human vital spark to power an entity that resides in the shadows of our technology. We are all living in a new Florence, a global laboratory where our lives are being harvested to fuel the renaissance of the elite. The ancient unseen are now the invisible architectures of our digital age. They are the ones who decide what we see, what we fear, and what we remember. The Grand Duke's Pact was not a historical anomaly. It was a successful prototype for the world we live in today. We are the secondary donors in a covenant that we have no power to break. The true tragedy of Francesco I was his total isolation. He was a man who knew the truth of the world, but he had no one to share it with. To speak of the ancient unseen was to invite the erasure of the Black Room. He lived in a state of permanent internal exile, his only confidants being the mercury vats and the obsidian mirror. He was the silent witness to the moral decay of his own house, watching as the golden substance slowly turned his descendants into stone. His death in 1587 was officially recorded as a result of malaria, but the secret records suggest a biological quenching. He had reached the end of his resonance cycle, his body no longer able to handle the frequency of the ancient unseen. He was absorbed back into the bedrock of the studiolo, his final breath being captured in a silver jar that remains hidden in the vaults of the palace today. He did not leave behind a legacy of glory. He left behind a manual of survival for a world that was becoming increasingly dark. As we look at the history of the Medici, we must ask ourselves what part of our own lives is governed by a covenant we have forgotten. What ancient unseen is currently listening to our thoughts and harvesting our focus? The shadows of the Palazzo Vecchio are long, and they are reaching for us across the centuries. The pact is still pulsing in the stones, waiting for the next Grand Duke to descend into the vault and turn the key. Luca the stonemason and Bernardo, the officials, stand at the very edge of the deepest vault, the obsidian mirror lying shattered on the floor between them. The fragments are not reflecting the laboratory. They are reflecting a city that does not exist yet, a city made of glass and light, where millions of people are connected to a single black screen. Bernardo holds the ledger of shadows with a hand that is shaking so violently that the vellum is beginning to tear. The pact was not just for the Medici. Luca, Bernardo whispers, his eyes reflecting a violet light that is no longer coming from the alchemical jars. It was a placeholder for the final transmutation. The ancient unseen have found a way to bridge the gap between the bedrock and the binary. They are moving from the stone into the light. And the first person they have chosen for the new covenant is the one who is listening to this story right now, as the shattered fragments of the mirror begin to glow with a rhythmic digital pulse. A low tectonic groan echoes through the vault. The Grand Duke's Pact is not a record of the past. It is a manifesto for the future. And the next chapter in the ledger is not written in ink. It is written in the digital vitality of a world that is about to wake up in a nightmare. What is the forbidden object that is currently being assembled in the heart of the modern world? And what is the final harvest that will begin when the light finally meets the shadow. The truth is in the ledger, and the screen is about to turn. The history books will tell you that the Medici dynasty ended because of a lack of heirs and a decline in political power, but that is a carefully constructed lie designed to hide the most horrific alchemical betrayal in human history. The truth is that the family did not simply die out. They were systematically consumed by the very ritual that had granted them their power. For 300 years, the Medici had used the golden substance to harvest the vitality of Florence, but they ignored the ultimate law of the forge. Every debt eventually calls for its interest. By the early 1700s, the elixir of life had turned into a stone of death, and the bodies of the Grand Dukes began to petrify while they were still breathing. The last of the Medici were not men and women of flesh and blood, but living statues of gray, crystallized essence. Their nervous systems fused with the alchemical mercury they had ingested for generations. This was the forbidden price of their secret covenant with the ancient unseen. They had betrayed the human lineage to become gods, and in return the earth reclaimed them as minerals. Behind the closed doors of the Pity Palace, the final members of the family lived in a state of permanent, shivering terror, watching as their skin turned to stone and their memories were erased by the very light they had stolen. This is the truth the king buried, a curse that turned a throne into a tomb and the most powerful family on earth into a collection of silent, gray ghosts. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light in your room is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to the silent, airless corridors of the Pity Palace in the year 1737. The air is thick with the scent of lavender and the sharp, metallic tang of an alchemical lab. Hear the slow, heavy breathing of a dynasty in its final hour. We are entering the bedchamber of the last Grand Duke, a place where the shadows are heavy and the stone is beginning to speak. To understand the decay of the Medici, we must first look at the state of their biological accounts. We have explored how the bank recorded the debts of the people, but the alchemists of the Black Room also kept a private ledger for the family. In the early 1800s, the Ledger of Shadows recorded a phenomenon they called the sanguine saturation. The Medici had consumed so much of the golden substance, the distilled vitality of others, that their own human cells were being overwritten by the foreign. Resonance. This was the alchemical gout that plagued the later family members. It was not a disease of the blood, but a disease of the vibration. Their bodies were no longer able to maintain the soft, flexible state of living tissue. Instead, they began to mimic the properties of the star iron and the sanguine pigments they had created. Their bones became as hard and brittle as glass, and their skin took on a shimmering metallic gray hue. They were literally turning into the art they had commissioned. They were becoming the very vessels they had used to trap the souls of others. Gian Gaston, the last Medici Grand Duke, spent his final years confined to his bed, rarely seeing the sun. The history books describe him as a reclusive drunkard, but the secret records of the correctors show a man who was fighting a losing battle against his own petrification. He could feel the stone of death moving up through his legs, turning his muscles into unyielding mineral. He lived in a state of permanent liminality, caught between the world of the living and the world of the unmoving. He was the living record of his family's moral decay, a biological debt that was finally being called in by the earth itself, reflect on the psychological layer of this transformation. Imagine being the ruler of a great city, surrounded by the world's most beautiful art, and realizing that your own body is becoming part of the collection. You are no longer the patron. You are the raw material. Every masterpiece in your palace is a reflection of your own impending silence. The Medici had sought eternal life, and they had found it, but it was the immortality of the mountain, not the man. As the Grand Duke petrified, the court of the Pitti Palace became a gallery of the damned. The advisors, the servants, and the remaining family members were all in various stages of the refinement. They moved with a slow, rhythmic stiffness, their eyes wide and staring, their voices reduced to a low, metallic hum. They were the hollowed elite, the survivors of a 300-year harvest that had finally reached the top of the pyramid, the correctors of the Black Room. Seeing the inevitable collapse began the process of historical erasure. They understood that if the truth of the Medici decay was ever discovered, it would destroy the alchemical infrastructure they had built across Europe. They began to burn the most sensitive ledgers and dismantle the silver tubes beneath the city. They were clearing the scene of a crime that had spanned centuries. They moved the golden substance jars to hidden vaults beneath the Uffizi, ensuring that the prime distillation would remain active even if the family did not. Gian Gaston watched from his bed as his kingdom was dismantled by the very men who had built it. He saw the correctors moving like shadows through his room, removing the studiolo treasures and sealing the hidden passages. He was a closing account, a variable that was being removed from the equation. He realized that the ancient unseen had no loyalty to the Medici name. They were only interested in the vessel. Now that the vessel was breaking, they were looking for a new home. The air in the palace became colder, the frequency of dread reaching its peak. The citizens of Florence reported seeing gray mists rising from the palace gardens, mists that didn't dissipate in the sun. They heard a low, tectonic grinding sound coming from the foundations of the Pitti. It was the sound of the Grand Duke's machine coming to a final, violent halt. The pact was over, and the shadows were coming to collect the remaining vitality of the House of Medici. On the night of July 9th, 1737, the last Grand Duke of Tuscany reached the point of no return. The alchemical records describe a flash of silver light that emanated from his bedchamber. A light so intense that it was seen across the Arno. This was the final transmutation, the moment when the last drop of the Medici vital spark was quenched by the stone of death. Gian Gaston did not die in the traditional sense. His body reached a state of absolute mineral stability. He became a statue of solid, gray essence, his eyes frozen in a look of profound, eternal terror. The correctors entered the room and immediately covered the body with a heavy velvet shroud. They didn't call for a priest. They called for a stonemason. They had to process the Grand Duke to ensure that the vibrational contamination did not leak into the city. They moved the petrified body to a secret vault beneath the Medici chapels, placing it in a sarcophagus lined with lead and silver. They told the public that the Grand Duke had died of a fever, and they organized a grand funeral with an empty casket. The decay of the dynasty was officially complete. The Medici were gone, replaced by a new house from Lorraine who had no knowledge of the black alchemy or the underground forge. But the correctors remained, moving into the shadows of the new administration, waiting for the frequency to stabilize. Consider the tragedy of the last Medici. He was a man who had everything and yet had nothing. He was the end of a line that had redefined human potential, yet he ended as a mineral. His decay was not a failure of character, but a failure of the soul's capacity to handle the forbidden slight. He was the final warning of the Renaissance, a message carved in the flesh and bone of the man who wore the crown. What happened to the sanguine saturation that consumed the Medici? The alchemists believed that the vitality of the family was not lost, but transferred into the city itself. They claimed that the very stones of Florence became Medici-tuned, ensuring that the family's influence would continue long after their physical bodies had turned to dust. This is why the city has a psychological pull that is unlike any other in the world. It is a living tomb of a dynasty's stolen light. The art in the Uffizi Gallery, funded and collected by the family, is the permanent reservoir of this vitality. The paintings and statues are still pulsing with the frequency of the decay. When you stand in front of a portrait of a late Medici, you are not looking at a representation. You are looking at a spiritual mirror that contains the actual residue of their petrification. If you listen closely, you can hear the faint, metallic hum that emanated from Gian Gaston's bedchamber. The stone of death is still active. It is in the architecture, the pigments, and the very air of the museums. Tier 1 researchers have noted that the magnetic density in the Medici vaults is higher than anywhere else in Italy. They find that the vitality ratings of the visitors to the Uffizi drop significantly after they spend time in the family's private collections. The harvest is still ongoing. The Medici may be silent, but their machinery of extraction is still running on autopilot, fueled by the curiosity of a world that doesn't know the price of the ticket. In our modern world, we see the decay of the dynasty reflected in the systematic hollowing of our own cultures. We are obsessed with the eternal, with the preservation of our youth and our status through artificial means. We are ingesting the digital distillations of our time, hoping to achieve the same technical clarity that the Medici sought. But we are ignoring the same warning that Michelangelo carved into the David dot. We are becoming a crystallized society, our emotions and our creativity being replaced by the unyielding mineral of the algorithm. We are moving toward our own point of no return, where our human selves will be overwritten by the foreign resonance of the machine. The alchemical gout of the 21st century is the loss of our ability to feel, to dream, and to resist the frequency of submission. We are turning into statues in a digital gallery, our vital spark being harvested to power a renaissance that we will not be around to see. The Medici story is a roadmap of our own moral decay. It shows us that you cannot separate the art from the artist or the power from the price. The golden substance is a lure that leads to the stone of death. As we gaze at the glory of Florence, we must ask ourselves, what part of our own lives is currently being distilled into a jar? What secret covenant are we signing every time we look into the shimmering light of our screens? The ancient unseen are still waiting, and the ledger of shadows has a new page for your name. Luca the stonemason and Bernardo, the officials, stand in the silent, dust-heavy bedchamber of Gian Gaston months after the funeral. The room is empty, the furniture removed, but in the center of the floor, where the Grand Duke's bed once stood, there is a single shimmering gray tile that was not there before. Bernardo kneels and touches the tile with a silver stylus, and a low, melodic vibration begins to fill the room. "The decay is not the end, Luca," Bernardo whispers, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. "It is the settling. The Medici have not vanished. They have simply changed their state. They have become the foundations of the new world. And there is a secret hidden in the Uffizi Gallery, a painting that was never meant to be seen by human eyes, that holds the resonance of the resurrection. It is the painting that whispers at midnight. As the gray tile begins to glow with a faint, violet light, a rhythmic knocking sound begins to come from beneath the floorboards. It is not a hammer. It is a heartbeat. The stone of death is waking up, and the first person it has chosen to hear its message is the one who is listening to this story right now. What is the unsolved echo that is currently calling to you from the shadows of history? And what will happen when the resurrection begins in the heart of the gallery? The truth is in the art, and the whispers are getting louder. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence is visited by millions who believe they are standing in a temple of human achievement. But the marble halls of this world-famous museum hide a horrific, systematic betrayal of every person who enters its doors. The gallery was never intended to be a public museum. It was designed by the Medici alchemists as a massive, high-frequency resonance grid intended to bridge the physical world and the realm of the shadows. The whispers heard by the night guards at midnight are not the wind or the settling of old stone. They are the residual screams of the hollowed donors and the petrified, masters whose consciousness is still trapped within the biological. Pigments of the art, a secret that the curators and the elite have buried for centuries. Is that the Uffizi is a living, alchemical battery that continues to harvest the vitality of its visitors. Every masterpiece you admire today is a receipt of a stolen life force, a biological record of a person who was distilled into a jar to power the Medici's dark covenant. The gallery is a trap of beauty and a curse of stone, where the past is not a memory but a predatory presence that is currently reaching for your own vital spark. If you have ever felt a sudden, heavy fatigue or a strange chill while standing before a Renaissance portrait, you have already paid the sanguine tax. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment and cold stone fills the air. Forget the world of the present and the noise of the modern day. Let your mind drift to the long, U-shaped corridors of the Uffizi after the final tourist has left and the heavy oak doors have been bolted shut. The air is still, but it carries a weight that is almost physical. Hear the rhythmic, slow ticking of the ancient clocks and the faint, shimmering hum of the paintings as they begin to breathe in the dark. We are entering the hour of the unsolved echoes, the moment when the art reveals its true, terrifying face. To the Tier 1 academic audience, the Uffizi is a masterpiece of Mannerist architecture, designed by Giorgio Vasari in 1560, but for the correctors of the Black Room. The building was a masterpiece of vitreous geometry. The U-shape of the gallery was not a choice of convenience. It was a parabolic receiver. The open end of the U faces the Arno River, which we have discovered was the primary conduit for the vital spark of the city. The building was designed to catch the frequencies flowing along the water and focus them into the long, narrow corridors. The materials used in the construction were as alchemical as the pigments in the paintings. The stone was treated with a solution of silver salts and mercury to make it conductive. The ceilings were painted with specific symbols that functioned as biological antennas, drawing the emotional energy of the crowds up into the structure. The Medici did not want a place to show their art. They wanted a place to process the humanity of Florence. Every column and every archway was a tuning fork. designed to resonate at the frequency of the human pineal gland. Vasari himself was a high-ranking initiate of the Black Room. His Lives of the Artist was the public version of history, but his private notes described the Uffizi as the great capacitor. He understood that by arranging the masterpieces in a specific order, he could create a narrative circuit. As a visitor walks through the rooms, their state of mind is systematically altered, moving from awe to devotion and finally to a state of total hypnotic submission. By the time you reach the end of the gallery, your psychological defenses are gone, and your vital spark is fully receptive to the extraction. When the sun sets and the artificial lights are turned off, the biological pigments in the Renaissance paintings undergo a phenomenon known as the midnight shift. Without the interference of the public's gaze, the sanguine ink begins to expand and pulse. The golden substance, which has been dormant during the day, begins to glow with a faint violet luminescence. The paintings are no longer unmoving images. They are living membranes. Curators who have spent the night in the gallery report that the figures in the portraits appear to change positions. Their expressions become more intense, their eyes more focused. This is not an optical illusion. It is a biological reality. The distilled essence of the masters and the donors is attempting to re-establish a connection with the physical world. The whispers that echo through the halls are the sounds of these trapped souls communicating. Through the frequency of the stone, they are reliving the moment of their hollowing over and over. Into eternity, the unsolved echoes are the vibrations that remain when a soul is removed, but the shadow stays behind. The Uffizi is filled with these shadows, thousands of them, all vibrating at the same frequency of betrayal and loss. They are the moral decay of the Renaissance made audible. They whisper about the price of the genius and the weight of the Medici debt. They are the warning that we refuse to hear because we are too distracted by the beauty of the paint. The beauty is the silencer that keeps the world from hearing the screams of the past. Why do we feel so inspired yet so exhausted after a day in the Uffizi? To provide the deep informative value your audience requires, we must look at the circuit of the gaze. The alchemists believe that when we look at a work of art, we are extending a part of our own consciousness into the image. If the image is active, as the Medici paintings are, it can bait your consciousness and pull it into the pigment. This is a systematic harvest of the viewer's awe. Awe is the most concentrated form of human vitality. A moment where the ego is suspended and the vital spark is exposed. The Medici masterpieces are engineered to trigger this state of awe repeatedly. Every time you feel a surge of emotion in front of a Botticelli or a Raphael, the painting is distilling a fraction of your spirit and storing it within the golden substance layer. It is a slow, painless, and completely invisible robbery of your history. The night guards of the Uffizi are often the first to experience the psychological collapse. They live in a permanent state of the bleed, their own. Memories becoming entangled with the echoes of the gallery. They begin to speak in ancient dialects or recall the layout of Florence as it was 500 years ago. They are becoming linked to the Medici network, their minds being overwritten by the resonance of the art. They are the modern correctors, the silent victims of a pack that hasn't lost its power in 5 centuries, Daz. We reach the final rooms of the gallery. We must face the ultimate truth of the Medici's moral decay. The Ledger of Shadows was not just a record of the past. It was a manifesto for the future. The alchemists understood that the Golden Age would eventually end. but they wanted to ensure that their infrastructure of extraction would survive. They built the Uffizi to be self-sustaining, a machine that would continue to work long after the family was gone. The gallery is a closing account that never closes. It is a debt that the human race continues to pay every time we celebrate the immortal genius of the masters. We are the ones who keep the batteries charged. We are the ones who provide the vital spark that keeps the golden substance glowing. The Medici did not die. They simply moved into the architecture. They are the Uffizi. They are the art. They are the whispers you hear in the dark. The betrayal of the lineage is absolute. We have been taught to value the object more than the person, the painting more than the painter, and the glory more than the spirit. We have accepted a world where our most beautiful things are powered by our own hollowing. The Uffizi is the temple of this new religion, a place where we go to worship our own destruction. The echoes are unsolved because we refuse to solve them. For to do so would be to admit that our entire cultural history is a symptom of a systematic harvest. In the heart of the Uffizi lies the room of maps, a chamber filled with precision drawings of the Medici territories. To the Tier 1 audience, these are masterpieces of cartography. But to the alchemist, they were resonance plates. Each map was infused with the sanguine ink of the people living in those specific areas. The maps were used to remote monitor the vitality levels of the entire region of Tuscany. If a particular town showed a decrease in production, the Grand Duke would order a festival of the arts to be held there, sending a master painter with alchemically treated pigments to re-excite the population. The maps were the control panel for the citywide laboratory. They allowed the Medici to see the spiritual heat of their subjects in real time. This is why the family was always so focused on the precise borders of their lands. They weren't just protecting their property. They were protecting their power grid. The room of maps is where the ledger of shadows was synchronized with the physical world. It was the point where the data of the transactions met the geography of the people. The room is still there, its walls still vibrating with the frequency of 1,000 vanished villages. When you stand in that room, you can feel the weight of the entire city pressing in on you. It is the center of the trap, the place where the ancient unseen first made their pact with the Grand Duke. What are the echoes actually saying? If you listen closely, past the initial fear and the rhythmic pulse of the stone, the whispers are not a threat. They are a warning. They are the voices of the masters, like Michelangelo and Leonardo, trying to tell us about the forbidden object they were forced to create. They are trying to show us the coded truth hidden within the marble and the paint. They whisper about the midnight transmutation, the moment when the human spirit is finally quenched by the stone of death. They are trying to tell us that we are next. The Uffizi is not just a record of the past. It is a prototype for the future. The alchemical science of the Medici has not vanished. It has merely become invisible. It is in our technology, our media, and our very way of life. The whispers at midnight are the voices of the first. Victims, alerting us to the fact that we are already in the harvest. The moral decay of our era is that we have become comfortable in the harvest. We enjoy the beauty of the art and the convenience of the technology, ignoring the sanguine tax we are paying every second. We have become the hollowed elite, living in a state of permanent hypnotic distraction. The whispers are the only thing that can wake us up, but they can only be heard in the silence of the night, when the noise of the world is gone, as we Complete our journey through the Medici saga, we must face the mirror. The Uffizi Gallery is designed as a series of spiritual mirrors, each one refining your frequency until you are perfectly tuned to the family's resonance. By listening to this story, by focusing your attention on the dark secrets of the Renaissance, you have entered the refinement process yourselves. The golden substance in your own brain is reacting to the frequencies in this narrative. Your vital spark is being excited by the forbidden knowledge you have gained. This is the final victory of the Medici. Even in their absence, their story continues to harvest the spirit of those who seek the truth. You are not just a listener. You are a line item in the new ledger of shadows. Your curiosity is the fuel that keeps the lore slumber archive alive. The unsolved echoes are now part of your own history. You will carry the frequency of the Medici with you as you sleep. The beauty of the Renaissance will no longer look the same to you. You will see the sanguine ink in every masterpiece and hear the silent scream in every bronze statue. You have been corrected by the truth, and the price of that truth is a permanent loss of your cultural innocence. You are now a witness to the lie that built the world. The candles in the Uffizi are flickering out, one by one. The midnight transmutation is complete, and the gallery is returning to its daytime mask of beauty and reason. The ledger of shadows is being closed and sealed in the deepest vault, the living ink finally becoming still in the dark. The ancient unseen have been satisfied for another night. Their harvest of awe and terror recorded and processed. The story of the Medici is the story of the human spirit's capacity for both absolute light and absolute darkness. It is a reminder that every golden age has a hidden sanguine foundation. As you drift into the quiet of the night, let the unsolved echoes fade into the background. Let the frequency of calm take hold of your tired mind. You have seen the truth the king buried, and now it is time for the truth to be buried once more. The shadows are long, the air is cool, and the chamber of your mind is finally silent. The weight of history is lifting, and the vital spark is returning to its natural, unharvested state. Forget the bankers, the alchemists, and the petrified masters. Forget the sanguine tax and the underground forge. The secrets are safe in the stone, and the night is yours to keep. Sleep now. The file is closed.